Title: Complete Original Short Stories of Guy de Maupassant. Author: Guy de Maupassant. Translator: A. E. Henderson. Albert Cohn McMaster. Louise Charlotte Garston Quesada. Volume I. A Study by Pole. Nevu, I entered literary life as a meteor, and I shall leave it like a thunderbolt. These words of Maupassant to José María de Heredia on the occasion of a memorable meeting are, in spite of their morbid solemnity, not an inexact summing up of the brief career during which, for 10 years, the writer, by turns undaunted and sorrowful, with the fertility of a master hand produced poetry, novels, romances and travels, only to sink prematurely into the abyss of madness and death. In the month of April, 1880, an article appeared in the Le Gaulois, announcing the publication of the Soirées de Meudon. It was signed by a name as yet unknown, Guy de Maupassant. After a juvenile diatribe against Romanticism and a passionate attack on languorous literature, the writer extolled the study of real life and announced the publication of the new work. It was picturesque and charming. In the quiet of evening, on an island, in the Seine, beneath poplars instead of the Neapolitan cypresses dear to the friends of Boccaccio, amid the continuous murmur of the valley, and no longer to the sound of the Pyrenean streams that murmured a faint accompaniment to the tales of Marguerite's cavaliers. The master and his disciples took turns in narrating some striking or pathetic episode of the war, and the issue, in collaboration, of these tales in one volume, in which the master jostled elbows with his pupils, took on the appearance of a manifesto, the tone of a challenge, or the utterance of a creed. In fact, however, the beginnings had been much more simple, and they had confined themselves, beneath the trees of Meudon, to deciding on a general title for the work. Zola had contributed the manuscript of the Attaque du Moulin, and it was at Maupassant's house that the 5 young men gave in their contributions. Each one read his story, Maupassant being the last. When he had finished Boule de Suif, with a spontaneous impulse, with an emotion they never forgot, filled with enthusiasm at this revelation, they all rose and, without superfluous words, acclaimed him as a master. He undertook to write the article for the Gaulois and, in cooperation with his friends, he worded it in the terms with which we are familiar, amplifying and embellishing it, yielding to an inborn taste for mystification which his youth rendered excusable. The essential point, he said, is to unmoor criticism. It was unmoored. The following day Wolfe wrote a polemical dissertation in the Figaro, and carried away his colleagues. The volume was a brilliant success, thanks to Boule de Suif. Despite the novelty, the honesty of effort, on the part of all, no mention was made of the other stories. Relegated to the second rank, they passed without notice. From his first battle, Maupassant was master of the field in literature. At once the entire press took him up and said what was appropriate regarding the budding celebrity. Biographers and reporters sought information concerning his life. As it was very simple and perfectly straightforward, they resorted to invention. And thus it is that at the present day Maupassant appears to us like one of those ancient heroes whose origin and death are veiled in mystery. I will not dwell on Guy de Maupassant's younger days. His relatives, his old friends, he himself, here and there in his works. have furnished us in their letters enough valuable revelations and touching remembrances of the years preceding his literary debut. His worthy biographer, H. Edouard Manuel, after collecting intelligently all the writings, condensing and comparing them, has been able to give us some definite information regarding that early period. I will simply recall that he was born on the 5th of August, 1850, near Dieppe, in the castle of Miromesnil, which he describes in Un Vie. Maupassant, like Flaubert, was a Norman, through his mother. And through his place of birth he belonged to that strange and adventurous race, whose heroic and long voyages on tramp trading ships he liked to recall. And just as the author of Education Sentimental seems to have inherited in the paternal line the shrewd realism of Champagne, so de Maupassant appears to have inherited from his Lorraine ancestors their indestructible discipline and cold lucidity. His childhood was passed at Étretat. His beautiful childhood, it was there that his instincts were awakened in the unfoldment of his prehistoric soul. Years went by in an ecstasy of physical happiness. The delight of running at full speed through fields of gorse, the charm of voyages of discovery in hollows and ravines, games beneath the dark hedges, a passion for going to sea with the fishermen and, on nights when there was no moon, for dreaming on their boats of imaginary voyages. Madame de Maupassant, who had guided her son's early reading, and had gazed with him at the sublime spectacle of nature, put off as long as possible the hour of separation. One day, however, she had to take the child to the little seminary at Yvetot. Later, he became a student at the college at Rouen, and became a literary correspondent of Louis Boulhay. It was at the latter's house on those Sundays in winter when the Norman rain drowned the sound of the bells and dashed against the window panes that the schoolboy learned to write poetry. Vacation took the rhetorician back to the north of Normandy. Now it was shooting at St. Julien-le-Hospitalier, across fields, bogs, and through the woods. From that time on he sealed his pact with the earth, and those deep and delicate roots which attached him to his native soil began to grow. It was of Normandy, broad, fresh and virile, that he would presently demand his inspiration, fervent and eager as a boy's love. It was in her that he would take refuge when, weary of life, he would implore a truce, or when he simply wished to work and revive his energies in old-time joys. It was at this time that was born in him that voluptuous love of the sea, which in later days could alone withdraw him from the world, calm him, console him. In 1870 he lived in the country, then he came to Paris to live, for, the family fortunes having dwindled, he had to look for a position. For several years he was a clerk in the Ministry of Marine, where he turned over musty papers, in the uninteresting company of the clerks of the Admiralty. Then he went into the Department of Public Instruction, where bureaucratic servility is less intolerable. The daily duties are certainly scarcely more onerous, and he had his chiefs, or colleagues, Xavier Charmes and Leon Dierks, Henry Roujon and René Bellot. But his office looked out on a beautiful melancholy garden with immense plane trees around which black circles of crows gathered in winter. Maupassant made two divisions of his spare hours, one for boating, and the other for literature. Every evening in spring, every free day, he ran down to the river, whose mysterious current, veiled in fog or sparkling in the sun, called to him and bewitched him. in the islands in the Seine between Chatou and Port Marly. On the banks of Sartrouville and Triel he was long noted among the population of boatmen, who have now vanished, for his unwearying biceps, his cynical gaiety of good fellowship, his unfailing practical jokes, his broad witticisms. Sometimes he would row with frantic speed, free and joyous, through the glowing sunlight on the stream. Sometimes he would wander along the coast, questioning the sailors, chatting with the ravageurs, or junk gatherers. Or stretched at full length amid the irises and tansy he would lie for hours watching the frail insects that play on the surface of the stream, water spiders, or white butterflies, dragonflies, chasing each other amid the willow leaves, or frogs asleep on the lily pads. The rest of his life was taken up by his work, without ever becoming despondent. Silent and persistent, he accumulated manuscripts, poetry, criticisms, plays, romances and novels. Every week he docilely submitted his work to the great Flaubert, the childhood friend of his mother and his uncle Alfred Louis Poitevin. The master had consented to assist the young man, to reveal to him the secrets that make chefs d'oeuvre immortal. It was he who compelled him to make copious research and to use direct observation, and who inculcated in him a horror of vulgarity and a contempt for facility. Maupassant himself tells us of those severe initiations in the Rue Murillo, or in the tent at Croisset. He has recalled the implacable didactics of his old master, his tender brutality, the paternal advice of his generous and candid heart. For 7 years Flaubert slashed, pulverized the awkward attempts of his pupil whose success remained uncertain. Suddenly, in a flight of spontaneous perfection, he wrote Boule de Suif. His master's joy was great and overwhelming. He died 2 months later. Until the end Maupassant remained illuminated by the reflection of the good, vanished giant. By that touching reflection that comes from the dead to those souls they have so profoundly stirred. The worship of Flaubert was a religion from which nothing could distract him. Neither work, nor glory, nor slow-moving waves, nor balmy nights. At the end of his short life, while his mind was still clear, he wrote to a friend, "I am always thinking of my poor Flaubert. And I say to myself that I should like to die if I were sure that anyone would think of me in the same manner." During these long years of his novitiate Maupassant had entered the social literary circles. He would remain silent, preoccupied, and if anyone, astonished at his silence, asked him about his plans, he answered simply, "I am learning my trade." However, under the pseudonym of Guy de Valmont, he had sent some articles to the newspapers, and, later, with the approval and by the advice of Flaubert, he published, in the République des Lettres, poems signed by his name. These poems, overflowing with sensuality, where the hymn to the earth describes the transports of physical possession, where the impatience of love expresses itself in loud melancholy appeals like the calls of animals in the spring nights, are valuable chiefly inasmuch as they reveal the creature of instinct, the faun escaped from his native forests, that Maupassant was in his early youth. But they add nothing to his glory. They are the rhymes of a prose writer, as Jules Lemaitre said. To mold the expression of his thought according to the strictest laws, and to narrow it down to some extent, such was his aim. Following the example of one of his comrades of Medan, being readily carried away by precision of style and the rhythm of sentences, By the imperious rule of the ballad, of the pantoum or the chant royal, Maupassant also desired to write in metrical lines. However, he never liked this collection that he often regretted having published. His encounters with prosody had left him with that monotonous weariness that the horseman and the fencer feel after a period in the riding school, or a bout with the foils. Such, in very broad lines, is the story of Maupassant's literary apprenticeship. The day following the publication of Boule de Suif, his reputation began to grow rapidly. The quality of his story was unrivaled, but at the same time it must be acknowledged that there were some who, for the sake of discussion, desired to place a young reputation in opposition to the triumphant brutality of Zola. From this time on, Maupassant, at the solicitation of the entire press, set to work and wrote story after story. His talent, free from all influences, his individuality, are not disputed for a moment. With a quick step, steady and alert, he advanced to fame. A fame of which he himself was not aware, but which was so universal that no contemporary author during his life ever experienced the same. The meteor sent out its light, and its rays were prolonged without limit, in article after article, volume on volume. He was now rich and famous. He is esteemed all the more as they believe him to be rich and happy. But they do not know that this young fellow with the sunburnt face, thick neck and salient muscles, whom they invariably compare to a young bull at liberty, and whose love affairs they whisper, is ill, very ill. At the very moment that success came to him, the malady that never afterwards left him came also, and, seated motionless at his side, gazed at him with its threatening countenance. He suffered from terrible headaches, followed by nights of insomnia. He had nervous attacks, which he soothed with narcotics and anesthetics, which he used freely. His sight, which had troubled him at intervals, became affected, and a celebrated oculist spoke of abnormality, asymmetry of the pupils. The famous young man trembled in secret, and was haunted by all kinds of terrors. The reader is charmed at the saneness of this revived art, and yet, here and there, he is surprised to discover, amid descriptions of nature that are full of humanity, disquieting flights towards the supernatural, distressing conjurations, veiled at first, of the most commonplace, the most vertiginous shuddering fits of fear, as old as the world and as eternal as the unknown. But, instead of being alarmed, he thinks that the author must be gifted with infallible intuition to follow out thus the taints in his characters, even through their most dangerous mazes. The reader does not know that these hallucinations which he describes so minutely were experienced by Maupassant himself. He does not know that the fear is in himself. The anguish of fear which is not caused by the presence of danger, or of inevitable death, but by certain abnormal conditions, by certain mysterious influences in presence of vague dangers, the fear of fear, the dread of that horrible sensation of incomprehensible terror. How can one explain these physical sufferings and this morbid distress that were known for some time to his intimates alone? Alas! The explanation is only too simple. All his life, consciously or unconsciously, Maupassant fought this malady, hidden as yet, which was latent in him. As his malady began to take a more definite form, he turned his steps towards the south, only visiting Paris to see his physicians and publishers. In the old port of Antibes, beyond the causeway of Cannes, his yacht, Belle Ami, which he cherished as a brother, lay at anchor and awaited him. He took it to the white cities of the Genoese Gulf, towards the palm trees of Hyères, or the red bay trees of Anthier. After several tragic weeks in which, from instinct, he made a desperate fight, on the 1st of January, 1892, he felt he was hopelessly vanquished. And in a moment of supreme clearness of intellect, like Gerard de Nerval, he attempted suicide. Less fortunate than the author of Sylvia, he was unsuccessful. But his mind, henceforth, indifferent to all unhappiness, had entered into eternal darkness. He was taken back to Paris and placed in Dr. Muriat's sanatorium, where, after 18 months of mechanical existence, the meteor quietly passed away. Boule d'Esuif, for several days in succession fragments of a defeated army had passed through the town. They were mere disorganized bands, not disciplined forces. The men wore long, dirty beards and tattered uniforms. They advanced in listless fashion, without a flag, without a leader. All seemed exhausted, worn out, incapable of thought or resolve, marching onward merely by force of habit, and dropping to the ground with fatigue the moment they halted. One saw, in particular, many enlisted men, peaceful citizens, men who lived quietly on their income, bending beneath the weight of their rifles, and little active volunteers, easily frightened but full of enthusiasm, as eager to attack as they were ready to take to flight, and amid these, a sprinkling of red-breeched soldiers. The pitiful remnant of a division cut down in a great battle, somber artillerymen, side by side with nondescript foot soldiers, and, here and there, the gleaming helmet of a heavy-footed dragoon who had difficulty in keeping up with the quicker pace of the soldiers of the line. Legions of irregulars with high-sounding names. Avengers of defeat, citizens of the tomb, brethren in death, passed in their turn, looking like banditti. Their leaders, former drapers or grain merchants, or tallow or soap chandlers. Warriors by force of circumstances, officers by reason of their mustachios or their money, covered with weapons, flannel and gold lace, spoke in an impressive manner, discussed plans of campaign, and behaved as though they alone bore the fortunes of dying France on their braggart shoulders, though, in truth, they frequently were afraid of their own men, scoundrels often brave beyond measure, but pillagers and debauches. Rumor had it that the Prussians were about to enter Rouen. The members of the National Guard, who for the past 2 months had been reconnoitering with the utmost caution in the neighboring woods, occasionally shooting their own sentinels, and making ready for fight whenever a rabbit rustled in the undergrowth, had now returned to their homes. Their arms, their uniforms, all the death-dealing paraphernalia with which they had terrified all the milestones along the highroad for 8 miles round, had suddenly and marvelously disappeared. The last of the French soldiers had just crossed the Seine on their way to Pont-Audemer, through Saint-Sever and Bourgachard, and in their rear the vanquished general, powerless to do aught with the forlorn remnants of his army, himself dismayed at the final overthrow of a nation accustomed to victory and disastrously beaten despite its legendary bravery, walked between 2 orderlies. Then a profound calm, a shuddering, silent dread, settled on the city. Many a round-paunched citizen, emasculated by years devoted to business, anxiously awaited the conquerors. trembling lest his roasting jacks or kitchen knives should be looked upon as weapons. Life seemed to have stopped short, the shops were shut, the streets deserted. Now and then an inhabitant, awed by the silence, glided swiftly by in the shadow of the walls. The anguish of suspense made men even desire the arrival of the enemy. In the afternoon of the day following the departure of the French troops, a number of Uhlans, coming no one knew whence, passed rapidly through the town. A little later on, a black mass descended St. Catherine's Hill, while two other invading bodies appeared respectively on the Darnetal and the Bois Guillaume roads. The advance guards of the three corps arrived at precisely the same moment at the square of the Hôtel de Ville, and the German army poured through all the adjacent streets, its battalions making the pavement ring with their firm, measured tread. Orders shouted in an unknown, guttural tongue rose to the windows of the seemingly dead, deserted houses, while behind the fast-closed shutters eager eyes peered forth at the victors, masters now of the city, its fortunes, and its lives, by right of war. The inhabitants, in their darkened rooms, were possessed by that terror which follows in the wake of cataclysms, of deadly upheavals of the earth, against which all human skill and strength are vain. For the same thing happens whenever the established order of things is upset, when security no longer exists, when all those rights usually protected by the law of man or of nature are at the mercy of unreasoning, savage force. The earthquake crushing a whole nation under falling roofs, the flood let loose, and engulfing in its swirling depths the corpses of drowned peasants, along with dead oxen and beams torn from shattered houses, or the army, covered with glory, murdering those who defend themselves, making prisoners of the rest, pillaging in the name of the sword, and giving thanks to God to the thunder of cannon. All these are appalling scourges, which destroy all belief in eternal justice, all that confidence we have been taught to feel in the protection of heaven and the reason of man. Small detachments of soldiers knocked at each door, and then disappeared within the houses, for the vanquished saw they would have to be civil to their conquerors. At the end of a short time, once the first terror had subsided, calm was again restored. In many houses the Prussian officer ate at the same table with the family. He was often well-bred, and, out of politeness, expressed sympathy with France and repugnance at being compelled to take part in the war. This sentiment was received with gratitude. Besides, his protection might be needful some day or other. By the exercise of tact the number of men quartered in one's house might be reduced. And why should one provoke the hostility of a person on whom one's whole welfare depended? Such conduct would savor less of bravery than of foolhardiness. And foolhardiness is no longer a failing of the citizens of Rouen as it was in the days when their city earned renown by its heroic defenses. Last of all final argument based on the national politeness, the folk of Rouen said to one another that it was only right to be civil in one's own house, provided there was no public exhibition of familiarity with the foreigner. Out of doors, therefore, citizen and soldier did not know each other, but in the house both chatted freely. And each evening the German remained a little longer warming himself at the hospitable hearth. Even the town itself resumed by degrees its ordinary aspect. The French seldom walked abroad, but the streets swarmed with Prussian soldiers. Moreover, the officers of the Blue Hussars, who arrogantly dragged their instruments of death along the pavements, seemed to hold the simple townsmen in but little more contempt than did the French cavalry officers who had drunk at the same cafes the year before. But there was something in the air, a something strange and subtle, an intolerable foreign atmosphere like a penetrating odor, the odor of invasion. It permeated dwellings and places of public resort, changed the taste of food, made one imagine oneself in far distant lands, amid dangerous, barbaric tribes. The conquerors exacted money, much money. The inhabitants paid what was asked, they were rich. But, the wealthier a Norman tradesman becomes, the more he suffers at having to part with anything that belongs to him, at having to see any portion of his substance pass into the hands of another. Nevertheless, within 6 or 7 miles of the town, along the course of the river as it flows onward to Croisset, Diepedow, and Biassart, boatmen and fishermen often hauled to the surface of the water the body of a German, bloated in his uniform, killed by a blow from knife or club, his head crushed by a stone, or perchance pushed from some bridge into the stream below. The mud of the riverbed swallowed up these obscure acts of vengeance, savage, yet legitimate, these unrecorded deeds of bravery. These silent attacks fraught with greater danger than battles fought in broad day, and surrounded, moreover, with no halo of romance. For hatred of the foreigner ever arms a few intrepid souls, ready to die for an idea. At last, as the invaders, though subjecting the town to the strictest discipline, had not committed any of the deeds of horror with which they had been credited while on their triumphal march, the people grew bolder, and the necessities of business again animated the breasts of the local merchants. Some of these had important commercial interests at Havre, occupied at present by the French army, and wished to attempt to reach that port by overland route to Dieppe, taking the boat from there. Through the influence of the German officers whose acquaintance they had made, they obtained a permit to leave town from the general in command, a large 4-horse coach having, therefore, been engaged for the journey, and 10 passengers having given in their names to the proprietor, they decided to start on a certain Tuesday morning before daybreak, to avoid attracting a crowd. The ground had been frozen hard for some time past, and about 3 o'clock on Monday afternoon, large black clouds from the north shed their burden of snow uninterruptedly all through that evening and night. At 4:30 in the morning the travelers met in the courtyard of the Hôtel de Normandie, where they were to take their seats in the coach. They were still half asleep, and shivering with cold under their wraps. They could see one another, but indistinctly in the darkness, and the mountain of heavy winter wraps in which each was swathed made them look like a gathering of obese priests in their long cassocks. But 2 men recognized each other. A third accosted them, and the 3 began to talk. "I am bringing my wife," said one. "So am I." "And I, too." The first speaker added, "We shall not return to Rouen, and if the Prussians approach Havre we will cross to England." All 3, it turned out, had made the same plans, being of similar disposition and temperament. Still the horses were not harnessed. A small lantern carried by a stable boy emerged now and then from one dark doorway to disappear immediately in another. The stamping of horses' hoofs, deadened by the dung and straw of the stable, was heard from time to time, and from inside the building issued a man's voice. talking to the animals and swearing at them. A faint tinkle of bells showed that the harness was being got ready. This tinkle soon developed into a continuous jingling, louder or softer according to the movements of the horse, sometimes stopping altogether, then breaking out in a sudden peal accompanied by a pawing of the ground by an iron-shod hoof. The door suddenly closed. All noise ceased. The frozen townsmen were silent. They remained motionless, stiff with cold. A thick curtain of glistening white flakes fell ceaselessly to the ground. It obliterated all outlines, enveloped all objects in an icy mantle of foam. Nothing was to be heard throughout the length and breadth of the silent, winter-bound city save the vague, nameless rustle of falling snow, a sensation rather than a sound. The gentle mingling of light atoms which seemed to fill all space, to cover the whole world. The man reappeared with his lantern, leading by a rope a melancholy-looking horse, evidently being led out against his inclination. The hostler placed him beside the pole, fastened the traces, and spent some time in walking round him to make sure that the harness was all right, for he could use only one hand, the other being engaged in holding the lantern. As he was about to fetch the second horse, he noticed the motionless group of travelers, already white with snow, and said to them, "Why don't you get inside the coach? You'd be under shelter." At least, this did not seem to have occurred to them, and they at once took his advice. The three men seated their wives at the far end of the coach, then got in themselves. Lastly, the other vague, snow-shrouded forms clambered to the remaining places without a word. The floor was covered with straw, into which the feet sank. The ladies at the far end, having brought with them little copper foot-warmers heated by means of a kind of chemical fuel, proceeded to light these, and spent some time in expatiating in low tones on their advantages, saying over and over again things which they had all known for a long time. At last, 6 horses instead of 4 having been harnessed to the diligence, on account of the heavy roads, a voice outside asked, "Is every one there?" To which a voice from the interior replied, "Yes." And they set out. The vehicle moved slowly, at a snail's pace. The wheels sank into the snow. The entire body of the coach creaked and groaned. The horses slipped, puffed, steamed, and the coachman's long whip cracked incessantly, flying hither and thither, coiling up, then flinging out its length like a slender serpent, as it lashed some rounded flank, which instantly grew tense as it strained in further effort. But the day grew apace. Those light flakes which one traveler, a native of Rouen, had compared to a rain of cotton fell no longer. A murky light filtered through dark, heavy clouds, which made the country more dazzlingly white by contrast. A whiteness broken sometimes by a row of tall trees spangled with hoarfrost, or by a cottage roof hooded in snow. Within the coach, the passengers eyed one another curiously in the dim light of dawn. Right at the back, in the best seats of all, Monsieur and Madame Loiseau, wholesale wine merchants of the Rue Grandpont, slumbered opposite each other. Formerly clerk to a merchant who had failed in business, Loiseau had bought his master's interest and made a fortune for himself. He sold very bad wine at a very low price to the retail dealers in the country, and had the reputation, among his friends and acquaintances, of being a shrewd rascal, a true Norman, full of quips and wiles. So well established was his character as a cheat that, in the mouths of the citizens of Rouen. The very name of l'oiseau became a byword for sharp practice. Above and beyond this, l'oiseau was noted for his practical jokes of every description, his tricks, good or ill-natured. And no one could mention his name without adding at once, "He's an extraordinary man, l'oiseau." He was undersized and pot-bellied, had a florid face with grayish whiskers. His wife tall, strong, determined, with a loud voice and decided manner, represented the spirit of order and arithmetic in the business house which l'oiseau enlivened by his jovial activity. Beside them, dignified in bearing, belonging to a superior caste, sat Monsieur Carlamadon, a man of considerable importance, a king in the cotton trade, proprietor of 3 spinning mills, officer of the Legion of Honor, and member of the General Council. During the whole time the empire was in the ascendancy he remained the chief of the well-disposed opposition, merely in order to command a higher value for his devotion when he should rally to the cause which he meanwhile opposed with courteous weapons, to use his own expression. Madame Carlamadon, much younger than her husband, was the consolation of all the officers of good family quartered at Rouen. Pretty, slender, graceful, she sat opposite her husband, curled up in her furs, and gazing mournfully at the sorry interior of the coach. Her neighbors, the Comte and Comtesse Hubert de Breville, bore one of the noblest and most ancient names in Normandy. The Count, a nobleman advanced in years and of aristocratic bearing, strove to enhance by every artifice of the toilet his natural resemblance to King Henry IV, who, according to a legend of which the family were inordinately proud, had been the favored lover of a de Breville lady, and father of her child. The frail one's husband having, in recognition of this fact, been made a count and governor of a province, a colleague of Monsieur Carlamadon in the General Council. Count Hubert represented the Orleanist party in his department. The story of his marriage with the daughter of a small shipowner at Nantes had always remained more or less of a mystery. But as the Countess had an air of unmistakable breeding, entertained faultlessly, and was even supposed to have been loved by a son of Louis Philippe, the nobility vied with one another in doing her honor. And her drawing-room remained the most select in the whole countryside, the only one which retained the old spirit of gallantry, and to which access was not easy. The fortune of the Brevilles, all in real estate, amounted, it was said, to 500,000 francs a year. These 6 people occupied the farther end of the coach, and represented society, with an income, the strong, established society of good people with religion and principle. It happened by chance that all the women were seated on the same side, and the Countess had, moreover, as neighbors 2 nuns, who spent the time in fingering their long rosaries and murmuring paternosters and aves. One of them was old, and so deeply pitted with smallpox that she looked for all the world as if she had received a charge of shot full in the face. The other, of sickly appearance, had a pretty but wasted countenance, and a narrow, consumptive chest, sapped by that devouring faith which is the making of martyrs and visionaries. A man and woman, sitting opposite the 2 nuns, attracted all eyes. The man, a well-known character, was Cornudet, the Democrat, the terror of all respectable people. For the past 20 years his big red beard had been on terms of intimate acquaintance with the tankards of all the Republican cafes. With the help of his comrades and brethren, he had dissipated a respectable fortune left him by his father, an old established confectioner. And he now impatiently awaited the Republic, that he might at last be rewarded with the post he had earned by his revolutionary orgies. On the 4th of September, possibly as the result of a practical joke, he was led to believe that he had been appointed prefect. But when he attempted to take up the duties of the position, the clerks in charge of the office refused to recognize his authority, and he was compelled in consequence to retire. A good sort of fellow in other respects, inoffensive and obliging, he had thrown himself zealously into the work of making an organized defense of the town. He had had pits dug in the level country, young forest trees felled, and traps set on all the roads. Then, at the approach of the enemy, thoroughly satisfied with his preparations, he had hastily returned to the town. He thought he might now do more good at Havre, where new entrenchments would soon be necessary. The woman, who belonged to the courtesan class, was celebrated for an embonpoint unusual for her age, which had earned for her the sobriquet of boule de suif, tallow ball. Short and round, fat as a pig, with puffy fingers constricted at the joints, looking like rows of short sausages, with a shiny, tightly stretched skin and an enormous bust filling out the bodice of her dress. She was yet attractive and much sought after, owing to her fresh and pleasing appearance. Her face was like a crimson apple, a peony bud just bursting into bloom. She had 2 magnificent dark eyes, fringed with thick, heavy lashes, which cast a shadow into their depths. Her mouth was small, ripe, kissable, and was furnished with the tiniest of white teeth. As soon as she was recognized, the respectable matrons of the party began to whisper among themselves, and the words hussy and public scandal were uttered so loudly that boule de suif raised her head. She forthwith cast such a challenging, bold look at her neighbors that a sudden silence fell on the company, and all lowered their eyes, with the exception of Loiseau, who watched her with evident interest. But conversation was soon resumed among the 3 ladies, whom the presence of this girl had suddenly drawn together in the bonds of friendship, one might almost say in those of intimacy. They decided that they ought to combine, as it were, in their dignity as wives in face of this shameless hussy, for legitimized love always despises its easygoing brother. The 3 men, also, brought together by a certain conservative instinct awakened by the presence of Cornudet, spoke of money matters in a tone expressive of contempt for the poor. Count Hubert related the losses he had sustained at the hands of the Prussians, spoke of the cattle which had been stolen from him, the crops which had been ruined, with the easy manner of a nobleman who was also a 10-fold millionaire, and whom such reverses would scarcely inconvenience for a single year. Monsieur Care Lomadun, a man of wide experience in the cotton industry, had taken care to send 600,000 francs to England as provision against the rainy day he was always anticipating. As for Loiseau, he had managed to sell to the French Commissariat Department all the wines he had in stock, so that the state now owed him a considerable sum, which he hoped to receive at Havre. And all 3 eyed one another in friendly, well-disposed fashion. Although of varying social status, they were united in the brotherhood of money, in that vast Freemasonry made up of those who possess, who can jingle gold wherever they choose to put their hands into their breeches pockets. The coach went along so slowly that at 10 o'clock in the morning it had not covered 12 miles. 3 times the men of the party got out and climbed the hills on foot. The passengers were becoming uneasy, for they had counted on lunching at Totes, and it seemed now as if they would hardly arrive there before nightfall. Everyone was eagerly looking out for an inn by the roadside, when, suddenly, the coach foundered in a snowdrift, and it took 2 hours to extricate it. As appetites increased, their spirits fell. No inn, no wine shop could be discovered, the approach of the Prussians and the transit of the starving French troops having frightened away all business. The men sought food in the farmhouses beside the road, but could not find so much as a crust of bread. For the suspicious peasant invariably hid his stores for fear of being pillaged by the soldiers, who, being entirely without food, would take violent possession of everything they found. About 1 o'clock Loiseau announced that he positively had a big hollow in his stomach. They had all been suffering in the same way for some time, and the increasing gnawings of hunger had put an end to all conversation. Now and then someone yawned. Another followed his example, and each in turn, according to his character, breeding and social position, yawned either quietly or noisily, placing his hand before the gaping void whence issued breath condensed into vapor. Several times Boule de Suif stooped, as if searching for something under her petticoats. She would hesitate a moment, look at her neighbors, and then quietly sit upright again. All faces were pale and drawn. Loiseau declared he would give 1,000 francs for a knuckle of ham. His wife made an involuntary and quickly checked gesture of protest. It always hurt her to hear of money being squandered, and she could not even understand jokes on such a subject. As a matter of fact, "I don't feel well," said the Count. "Why did I not think of bringing provisions?" Each one reproached himself in similar fashion. Cornudet, however, had a bottle of rum, which he offered to his neighbors. They all coldly refused except Loiseau, who took a sip, and returned the bottle with thanks, saying, "That's good stuff, it warms one up, and cheats the appetite." The alcohol put him in good humor, and he proposed they should do as the sailors did in the song, eat the fattest of the passengers. This indirect allusion to Boule de Suif shocked the respectable members of the party. No one replied, only Cornudet smiled. The 2 good sisters had ceased to mumble their rosary, and, with hands enfolded in their wide sleeves, sat motionless, their eyes steadfastly cast down, doubtless offering up as a sacrifice to heaven the suffering it had sent them. At last, at 3 o'clock, as they were in the midst of an apparently limitless plain, with not a single village in sight, Boule de Suif stooped quickly and drew from underneath the seat a large basket covered with a white napkin. From this she extracted first of all a small earthenware plate and a silver drinking cup. Then an enormous dish containing 2 whole chickens cut into joints and embedded in jelly. The basket was seen to contain other good things, pies, fruit, dainties of all sorts, provisions, in fine, for a 3 days' journey, rendering their owner independent of wayside inns. The necks of 4 bottles protruded from among the food. She took a chicken wing, and began to eat it daintily, together with one of those rolls called in Normandy regents. All looks were directed toward her. An odor of food filled the air, causing nostrils to dilate, mouths to water, and jaws to contract painfully. The scorn of the ladies for this disreputable female grew positively ferocious. They would have liked to kill her, or throw her and her drinking cup, her basket, and her provisions out of the coach into the snow of the road below. But Loiseau's gaze was fixed greedily on the dish of chicken. He said, "Well, well, this lady had more forethought than the rest of us. Some people think of everything." She looked up at him. "Would you like some, sir? It is hard to go on fasting all day." He bowed. "Upon my soul, I can't refuse. I cannot hold out another minute. All is fair in wartime, is it not, madam?" And, casting a glance on those around, he added, "At times like this it is very pleasant to meet with obliging people." He spread a newspaper over his knees to avoid soiling his trousers, and, with a pocket knife he always carried, helped himself to a chicken leg coated with jelly, which he thereupon proceeded to devour. Then Boule le Suif, in low, humble tones, invited the nuns to partake of her repast. They both accepted the offer unhesitatingly, and after a few stammered words of thanks began to eat quickly, without raising their eyes. Neither did Cornudet refuse his neighbor's offer, and, in combination with the nuns, a sort of table was formed by opening out the newspaper over the 4 pairs of knees. Mouths kept opening and shutting, ferociously masticating and devouring the food. Loiseau, in his corner, was hard at work, and in low tones urged his wife to follow his example. She held out for a long time, but overstrained nature gave way at last. Her husband, assuming his politest manner, asked their charming companion if he might be allowed to offer Madame Loiseau a small helping. "Why, certainly, sir," she replied, with an amiable smile, holding out the dish. When the first bottle of claret was opened, some embarrassment was caused by the fact that there was only 1 drinking cup, but this was passed from one to another, after being wiped. Cornudet alone, doubtless in a spirit of gallantry, raised to his own lips that part of the rim which was still moist from those of his fair neighbor. Then, surrounded by people who were eating, and well-nigh suffocated by the odor of food, the Comte and Comtesse de Breville and Monsieur and Madame Carlamadon endured that hateful form of torture which has perpetuated the name of Tantalus. All at once the manufacturer's young wife heaved a sigh which made every one turn and look at her. She was white as the snow without, her eyes closed, her head fell forward, she had fainted. Her husband, beside himself, implored the help of his neighbors. No one seemed to know what to do until the elder of the 2 nuns, raising the patient's head, placed Boule de Suif's drinking cup to her lips, and made her swallow a few drops of wine. The pretty invalid moved, opened her eyes, smiled, and declared in a feeble voice that she was all right again. But, to prevent a recurrence of the catastrophe, the nun made her drink a cupful of claret, adding, "It's just hunger. That's what is wrong with you." Then Boule de Suif, blushing and embarrassed, stammered, looking at the 4 passengers who were still fasting, "Mon Dieu! If I might offer these ladies and gentlemen," she stopped short, fearing a snub. But Loiseau continued, "Hang it all! In such a case as this we are all brothers and sisters and ought to assist each other. Come, come, ladies, don't stand on ceremony, for goodness sake. Do we even know whether we shall find a house in which to pass the night? At our present rate of going we shan't be at Totes till midday tomorrow. They hesitated, no one daring to be the first to accept. But the Count settled the question. He turned toward the abashed girl, and in his most distinguished manner said, "We accept gratefully, madam." As usual, it was only the first step that cost. This Rubicon once crossed, they set to work with a will. The basket was emptied. It still contained a pâté de foie gras, a lark pie, a piece of smoked tongue, Crassain pears, Pont l'Evêque gingerbread, fancy cakes, and a cup full of pickled gherkins and onions, boule de suif, like all women, being very fond of indigestible things. They could not eat this girl's provisions without speaking to her. So they began to talk, stiffly at first, then, as she seemed by no means forward, with greater freedom. Mesdames de Breville and Kerlamadon, who were accomplished women of the world, were gracious and tactful. The Countess especially displayed that amiable condescension characteristic of great ladies whom no contact with baser mortals can sully, and was absolutely charming. But the sturdy Madame Loiseau, who had the soul of a gendarme, continued morose, speaking little and eating much. Conversation naturally turned on the war. Terrible stories were told about the Prussians, deeds of bravery were recounted of the French. And all these people who were fleeing themselves were ready to pay homage to the courage of their compatriots. Personal experiences soon followed, and boule de suif related with genuine emotion, and with that warmth of language not uncommon in women of her class and temperament, how it came about that she had left Rouen. "I thought at first that I should be able to stay," she said. "My house was well stocked with provisions, and it seemed better to put up with feeding a few soldiers than to banish myself goodness knows where. But when I saw these Prussians it was too much for me. My blood boiled with rage. I wept the whole day for very shame. Oh, if only I had been a man! I looked at them from my window, the fat swine, with their pointed helmets. And my maid held my hands to keep me from throwing my furniture down on them. Then some of them were quartered on me. I flew at the throat of the first one who entered. They are just as easy to strangle as other men. And I'd have been the death of that one if I hadn't been dragged away from him by my hair. I had to hide after that. And as soon as I could get an opportunity one left the place, and here I am." She was warmly congratulated. She rose in the estimation of her companions, who had not been so brave. And Cornudet listened to her with the approving and benevolent smile of an apostle, the smile a priest might wear in listening to a devotee praising God. For long-bearded Democrats of his type have a monopoly of patriotism, just as priests have a monopoly of religion. He held forth in turn, with dogmatic self-assurance, in the style of the proclamations daily pasted on the walls of the town, winding up with a specimen of stump oratory in which he reviled that besotted fool of a Louis Napoleon. But boule de suif was indignant, for she was an ardent Bonapartist. She turned as red as a cherry, and stammered in her wrath, "I'd just like to have seen you in his place, you and your sort. There would have been a nice mix-up." "Oh, yes. It was you who betrayed that man. It would be impossible to live in France if we were governed by such rascals as you." Cornudet, unmoved by this tirade, still smiled a superior, contemptuous smile, and one felt that high words were impending, when the Count interposed, and, not without difficulty, succeeded in calming the exasperated woman, saying that all sincere opinions ought to be respected. But the Countess and the manufacturer's wife, imbued with the unreasoning hatred of the upper classes for the Republic, and instinct, moreover, with the affection felt by all women for the pomp and circumstance of despotic government, were drawn, in spite of themselves, toward this dignified young woman, whose opinions coincided so closely with their own. The basket was empty. The 10 people had finished its contents without difficulty amid general regret that it did not hold more. Conversation went on a little longer, though it flagged somewhat after the passengers had finished eating. Night fell, the darkness grew deeper and deeper, and the cold made Boule de Suif shiver, in spite of her plumpness. So Madame de Breville offered her foot warmer, the fuel of which had been several times renewed since the morning. And she accepted the offer at once, for her feet were icy cold. Mesdames Carlomadon and Loiseau gave theirs to the nuns. The driver lighted his lanterns. They cast a bright gleam on a cloud of vapor which hovered over the sweating flanks of the horses, and on the roadside snow, which seemed to unroll as they went along in the changing light of the lamps. All was now indistinguishable in the coach. But suddenly a movement occurred in the corner occupied by Boule de Suif and Cornudet, and Loiseau, peering into the gloom, fancied he saw the big, bearded Democrat move hastily to one side, as if he had received a well-directed, though noiseless, blow in the dark. Tiny lights glimmered ahead. It was Totes. The coach had been on the road 11 hours, which, with the 3 hours allotted the horses in 4 periods for feeding and breathing, made 14. It entered the town, and stopped before the Hotel du Commerce. The coach door opened. A well-known noise made all the travelers start. It was the clanging of a scabbard on the pavement. Then a voice called out something in German. Although the coach had come to a standstill, no one got out. It looked as if they were afraid of being murdered the moment they left their seats. Thereupon the driver appeared, holding in his hand one of his lanterns, which cast a sudden glow on the interior of the coach, lighting up the double row of startled faces, mouths agape, and eyes wide open in surprise and terror. Beside the driver stood in the full light a German officer, a tall young man, fair and slender, tightly encased in his uniform like a woman in her corset, his flat shiny cap tilted to one side of his head, making him look like an English hotel runner. His exaggerated mustache, long and straight and tapering to a point at either end in a single blonde hair that could hardly be seen, seemed to weigh down the corners of his mouth and give a droop to his lips. In Alsatian French he requested the travelers to alight, saying stiffly, "Kindly get down, ladies and gentlemen." The 2 nuns were the first to obey, manifesting the docility of holy women accustomed to submission on every occasion. Next appeared the Count and Countess, followed by the manufacturer and his wife, after whom came Loiseau, pushing his larger and better half before him. "Good day, sir," he said to the officer as he put his foot to the ground, acting on an impulse born of prudence rather than of politeness. The other, insolent like all in authority, merely stared without replying. Boule de Suif and Cornudet, though near the door, were the last to alight, grave and dignified before the enemy. The stout girl tried to control herself and appear calm. The Democrat stroked his long russet beard with a somewhat trembling hand. Both strove to maintain their dignity, knowing well that at such a time each individual is always looked upon as more or less typical of his nation, and, also, resenting the complacent attitude of their companions. Boule de Suif tried to wear a bolder front than her neighbors, the virtuous women, while he, feeling that it was incumbent on him to set a good example, kept up the attitude of resistance which he had first assumed when he undertook to mine the high roads round Rouen. They entered the spacious kitchen of the inn, and the German, having demanded the passports signed by the general in command, in which were mentioned the name, description, and profession of each traveler, inspected them all minutely, comparing their appearance with the written particulars. Then he said brusquely, "All right," and turned on his heel. They breathed freely, all were still hungry, so supper was ordered. Half an hour was required for its preparation, and while two servants were apparently engaged in getting it ready, the travelers went to look at their rooms. These all opened off a long corridor, at the end of which was a glazed door with a number on it. They were just about to take their seats at table when the innkeeper appeared in person. He was a former horse dealer, a large, asthmatic individual, always wheezing, coughing, and clearing his throat. Follenvie was his patronymic. He called, "Mademoiselle Elizabeth Rousset?" Boule de Suif started, and turned round. "That is my name." "Mademoiselle, the Prussian officer wishes to speak to you immediately." "To me?" "Yes." "If you are Mademoiselle Elizabeth Rousset." She hesitated, reflected a moment, and then declared roundly, "That may be, but I'm not going." They moved restlessly around her. Everyone wondered and speculated as to the cause of this order. The Count approached. "You are wrong, madam. For your refusal may bring trouble not only on yourself, but also on all your companions. It never pays to resist those in authority. Your compliance with this request cannot possibly be fraught with any danger. It has probably been made because some formality or other was forgotten." All added their voices to that of the Count. Boule de Suif was begged, urged, lectured, and at last convinced. Everyone was afraid of the complications which might result from headstrong action on her part. She said finally, "I am doing it for your sakes, remember that." The Countess took her hand. "And we are grateful to you." She left the room. All waited for her return before commencing the meal. Each was distressed that he or she had not been sent for rather than this impulsive, quick-tempered girl, and each mentally rehearsed platitudes in case of being summoned also. But at the end of 10 minutes she reappeared breathing hard, crimson with indignation. "Oh, the scoundrel! The scoundrel!" she stammered. All were anxious to know what had happened, but she declined to enlighten them, and when the Count pressed the point, she silenced him with much dignity, saying, "No, the matter has nothing to do with you, and I cannot speak of it." Then they took their places round a high soup tureen, from which issued an odor of cabbage. In spite of this coincidence, the supper was cheerful. The cider was good. The Loiseaus and the nuns drank it from motives of economy. The others ordered wine. Cornudet demanded beer. He had his own fashion of uncorking the bottle and making the beer foam. gazing at it as he inclined his glass and then raised it to a position between the lamp and his eye that he might judge of its color. When he drank, his great beard, which matched the color of his favorite beverage, seemed to tremble with affection. His eyes positively squinted in the endeavor not to lose sight of the beloved glass. And he looked for all the world as if he were fulfilling the only function for which he was born. He seemed to have established in his mind an affinity between the two great passions of his life, pale ale and revolution. And assuredly he could not taste the one without dreaming of the other. Monsieur and Madame Follenvie dined at the end of the table. The man, wheezing like a broken-down locomotive, was too short-winded to talk when he was eating. But the wife was not silent a moment. She told how the Prussians had impressed her on their arrival, what they did, what they said, execrating them in the first place because they cost her money, and in the second because she had 2 sons in the army. She addressed herself principally to the Countess, flattered at the opportunity of talking to a lady of quality. Then she lowered her voice, and began to broach delicate subjects. Her husband interrupted her from time to time, saying, "You would do well to hold your tongue, Madame Follenvie." But she took no notice of him, and went on, "Yes, madam, these Germans do nothing but eat potatoes and pork, and then pork and potatoes. And don't imagine for a moment that they are clean. No, indeed. And if only you saw them drilling for hours, indeed for days, together, they all collect in a field. Then they do nothing but march backward and forward, and wheel this way and that. If only they would cultivate the land, or remain at home and work on their high roads. Really, madam, these soldiers are of no earthly use. Poor people have to feed and keep them, only in order that they may learn how to kill. True, I am only an old woman with no education. But when I see them wearing themselves out marching about from morning till night, I say to myself, when there are people who make discoveries that are of use to people, why should others take so much trouble to do harm? Really, now, isn't it a terrible thing to kill people, whether they are Prussians, or English, or Poles, or French? If we revenge ourselves on anyone who injures us, we do wrong, and are punished for it. But when our sons are shot down like partridges, that is all right. And decorations are given to the man who kills the most. No, indeed, I shall never be able to understand it." Cornudet raised his voice. "War is a barbarous proceeding when we attack a peaceful neighbor, but it is a sacred duty when undertaken in defense of one's country." The old woman looked down. "Yes. It's another matter when one acts in self-defense, but would it not be better to kill all the kings, seeing that they make war just to amuse themselves?" Cornudet's eyes kindled. "Bravo. Citizens," he said. Monsieur Carlomadon was reflecting profoundly. Although an ardent admirer of great generals, the peasant woman's sturdy common sense made him reflect on the wealth which might accrue to a country by the employment of so many idle hands now maintained at a great expense, of so much unproductive force, if they were employed in those great industrial enterprises which it will take centuries to complete. But Loiseau, leaving his seat, went over to the innkeeper and began chatting in a low voice. The big man chuckled, coughed, sputtered. His enormous carcass shook with merriment at the pleasantries of the other. and he ended by buying 6 casks of claret from Loiseau to be delivered in spring, after the departure of the Prussians. The moment supper was over, everyone went to bed, worn out with fatigue. But Loiseau, who had been making his observations on the sly, sent his wife to bed, and amused himself by placing first his ear, and then his eye, to the bedroom keyhole, in order to discover what he called the mysteries of the corridor. At the end of about an hour he heard a rustling, peeped out quickly, and caught sight of Boule de Suif, looking more rotund than ever in a dressing gown of blue cashmere trimmed with white lace. She held a candle in her hand, and directed her steps to the numbered door at the end of the corridor. But one of the side doors was partly opened, and when, at the end of a few minutes, she returned, Cornudet, in his shirt sleeves, followed her. They spoke in low tones, then stopped short. Boule de Suif seemed to be stoutly denying him admission to her room. Unfortunately, Loiseau could not at first hear what they said, but toward the end of the conversation they raised their voices, and he caught a few words. Cornudet was loudly insistent. "How silly you are! What does it matter to you?" he said. She seemed indignant, and replied, "No, my good man, there are times when one does not do that sort of thing. Besides, in this place it would be shameful." Apparently he did not understand, and asked the reason. Then she lost her temper and her caution, and, raising her voice still higher, said, "Why? Can't you understand why? When there are Prussians in the house, perhaps even in the very next room." He was silent. The patriotic shame of this wanton, who would not suffer herself to be caressed in the neighborhood of the enemy, must have roused his dormant dignity. For after bestowing on her a simple kiss he crept softly back to his room. Loiseau, much edified, capered round the bedroom before taking his place beside his slumbering spouse. Then silence reigned throughout the house. But soon there arose from some remote part, it might easily have been either cellar or attic, a stertorous, monotonous, regular snoring. A dull, prolonged rumbling, varied by tremors like those of a boiler under pressure of steam. Monsieur Follenvie had gone to sleep. As they had decided on starting at 8 o'clock the next morning, everyone was in the kitchen at that hour, but the coach, its roof covered with snow, stood by itself in the middle of the yard, without either horses or driver. They sought the latter in the stables, coach-houses and barns, but in vain. So the men of the party resolved to scour the country for him, and sallied forth. They found themselves in the square, with the church at the farther side, and to right and left low-roofed houses where there were some Prussian soldiers. The first soldier they saw was peeling potatoes. The second, farther on, was washing out a barber's shop. Another, bearded to the eyes, was fondling a crying infant, and dandling it on his knees to quiet it, and the stout peasant women, whose menfolk were for the most part at the war, were, by means of signs, telling their obedient conquerors what work they were to do: chop wood, prepare soup, grind coffee. One of them even was doing the washing for his hostess, an infirm old grandmother. The Count, astonished at what he saw, questioned the beadle who was coming out of the presbytery. The old man answered, "Oh, those men are not at all a bad sort. They are not Prussians, I am told. They come from somewhere farther off, I don't exactly know where. And they have all left wives and children behind them. They are not fond of war either. You may be sure. I am sure they are mourning for the men where they come from, just as we do here, and the war causes them just as much unhappiness as it does us. As a matter of fact, things are not so very bad here just now, because the soldiers do no harm, and work just as if they were in their own homes. You see, sir, poor folk always help one another. It is the great ones of this world who make war. Cornudet, indignant at the friendly understanding established between conquerors and conquered, withdrew. Preferring to shut himself up in the inn, they are repeopling the country, jested Loiseau. They are undoing the harm they have done, said Monsieur Lamadon gravely. But they could not find the coach driver. At last he was discovered in the village café, fraternizing cordially with the officer's orderly. Were you not told to harness the horses at 8 o'clock? Demanded the Count. Oh, yes, but I've had different orders since. What orders? Not to harness at all. Who gave you such orders? Why? The Prussian officer. But why? I don't know. Go and ask him. I am forbidden to harness the horses, so I don't harness them, that's all. Did he tell you so himself? No, sir. The innkeeper gave me the order from him. When? Last evening, just as I was going to bed. The three men returned in a very uneasy frame of mind. They asked for Monsieur Follenvie. But the servant replied that on account of his asthma he never got up before 10 o'clock. They were strictly forbidden to rouse him earlier, except in case of fire. They wished to see the officer, but that also was impossible, although he lodged in the inn. Monsieur Follenvie alone was authorized to interview him on civil matters. So they waited. The women returned to their rooms, and occupied themselves with trivial matters. Cornudet settled down beside the tall kitchen fireplace, before a blazing fire. He had a small table and a jug of beer placed beside him, and he smoked his pipe, a pipe which enjoyed among Democrats a consideration almost equal to his own, as though it had served its country in serving Cornudet. It was a fine meerschaum, admirably colored to a black, the shade of its owner's teeth, but sweet-smelling, gracefully curved. At home in its master's hand, and completing his physiognomy. And Cornudet sat motionless, his eyes fixed now on the dancing flames, now on the froth which crowned his beer. And after each draught he passed his long, thin fingers with an air of satisfaction through his long, greasy hair, as he sucked the foam from his mustache. Loiseau, under pretense of stretching his legs, went out to see if he could sell wine to the country dealers. The Count and the manufacturer began to talk politics. They forecast the future of France. One believed in the Orleans dynasty, the other in an unknown savior, a hero who should rise up in the last extremity, a Du Guesclin, perhaps a Joan of Arc, or another Napoleon I. Ah! If only the Prince Imperial were not so young! Cornudet, listening to them, smiled like a man who holds the keys of destiny in his hands. His pipe perfumed the whole kitchen. As the clock struck 10, Monsieur Follenvie appeared. He was immediately surrounded and questioned, but could only repeat 3 or 4 times in succession, and without variation, the words, "The officer said to me, just like this, Monsieur Follenvie. You will forbid them to harness up the coach for those travelers tomorrow. They are not to start without an order from me. You hear? That is sufficient. Then they asked to see the officer. The Count sent him his card, on which Monsieur Carolamadon also inscribed his name and titles. The Prussian sent word that the two men would be admitted to see him after his luncheon. That is to say, about 1 o'clock. The ladies reappeared, and they all ate a little, in spite of their anxiety. Boule de Suif appeared ill and very much worried. They were finishing their coffee when the orderly came to fetch the gentleman. Loiseau joined the other two, but when they tried to get Cornudet to accompany them, by way of adding greater solemnity to the occasion, he declared proudly that he would never have anything to do with the Germans, and, resuming his seat in the chimney corner, he called for another jug of beer. The three men went upstairs, and were ushered into the best room in the inn, where the officer received them lolling at his ease in an armchair, his feet on the mantelpiece, smoking a long porcelain pipe, and enveloped in a gorgeous dressing-gown, doubtless stolen from the deserted dwelling of some citizen destitute of taste in dress. He neither rose, greeted them, nor even glanced in their direction. He afforded a fine example of that insolence of bearing which seems natural to the victorious soldier. After the lapse of a few moments he said in his halting French, "What do you want?" "We wish to start on our journey," said the Count. "No, may I ask the reason of your refusal?" "Because I don't choose." "I would respectfully call your attention, monsieur, to the fact that your general in command gave us a permit to proceed to Dieppe, and I do not think we have done anything to deserve this harshness at your hands. I don't choose, that's all. You may go." They bowed and retired. The afternoon was wretched. They could not understand the caprice of this German, and the strangest ideas came into their heads. They all congregated in the kitchen, and talked the subject to death, imagining all kinds of unlikely things. Perhaps they were to be kept as hostages, but for what reason? Or to be extradited as prisoners of war? Or possibly they were to be held for ransom. They were panic-stricken at this last supposition. The richest among them were the most alarmed, seeing themselves forced to empty bags of gold into the insolent soldiers' hands in order to buy back their lives. They racked their brains for plausible lies whereby they might conceal the fact that they were rich, and pass themselves off as poor, very poor. Loiseau took off his watch chain and put it in his pocket. The approach of night increased their apprehension. The lamp was lighted, and as it wanted yet 2 hours to dinner, Madame Loiseau proposed a game of 31. It would distract their thoughts. The rest agreed, and Cornudet himself joined the party, first putting out his pipe for politeness' sake. The Count shuffled the cards dealt, and Boule de Suif had 31 to start with. Soon the interest of the game assuaged the anxiety of the players. But Cornudet noticed that Loiseau and his wife were in league to cheat. They were about to sit down to dinner when Monsieur Follenvie appeared, and in his grating voice announced, "The Prussian officer sends to ask Mademoiselle Elizabeth Rousset if she has changed her mind yet." Boule de Suif stood still, pale as death. Then, suddenly turning crimson with anger, she gasped out, "Kindly tell that scoundrel, that cur, that carrion of a Prussian, that I will never consent, you understand, never, never, never." The fat innkeeper left the room. Then Boule de Suif was surrounded, questioned, entreated on all sides to reveal the mystery of her visit to the officer. She refused at first, but her wrath soon got the better of her. "What does he want?" "He wants to make me his mistress," she cried. No one was shocked at the word, so great was the general indignation. Cornudet broke his jug as he banged it down on the table. A loud outcry arose against this base soldier. All were furious. They drew together in common resistance against the foe. As if some part of the sacrifice exacted of Boule de Suif had been demanded of each. The Count declared, with supreme disgust, that those people behaved like ancient barbarians. The women, above all, manifested a lively and tender sympathy for Boule de Suif. The nuns, who appeared only at meals, cast down their eyes, and said nothing. They dined, however. As soon as the first indignant outburst had subsided, but they spoke little and thought much. The ladies went to bed early, and the men, having lighted their pipes, proposed a game of écarté, in which Monsieur Follenvie was invited to join. The travelers hoping to question him skillfully as to the best means of vanquishing the officer's obduracy. But he thought of nothing but his cards, would listen to nothing, reply to nothing, and repeated, time after time, "Attend to the game, gentlemen. Attend to the game." So absorbed was his attention that he even forgot to expectorate. The consequence was that his chest gave forth rumbling sounds like those of an organ. His wheezing lungs struck every note of the asthmatic scale, from deep, hollow tones to a shrill, hoarse piping resembling that of a young cock trying to crow. He refused to go to bed when his wife, overcome with sleep, came to fetch him. So she went off alone, for she was an early bird, always up with the sun, while he was addicted to late hours, ever ready to spend the night with friends. He merely said, "Put my eggnog by the fire," and went on with the game. When the other men saw that nothing was to be got out of him, they declared it was time to retire, and each sought his bed. They rose fairly early the next morning, with a vague hope of being allowed to start, a greater desire than ever to do so, and a terror at having to spend another day in this wretched little inn. Alas! The horses remained in the stable, the driver was invisible. They spent their time, for want of something better to do, in wandering round the coach. Luncheon was a gloomy affair, and there was a general coolness toward Boule de Suif, for night, which brings counsel, had somewhat modified the judgment of her companions. In the cold light of the morning they almost bore a grudge against the girl for not having secretly sought out the Prussian, that the rest of the party might receive a joyful surprise when they awoke. What more simple? Besides, who would have been the wiser? She might have saved appearances by telling the officer that she had taken pity on their distress. Such a step would be of so little consequence to her. But no one as yet confessed to such thoughts. In the afternoon, seeing that they were all bored to death, the Count proposed a walk in the neighborhood of the village. Each one wrapped himself up well, and the little party set out, leaving behind only Cornudet, who preferred to sit over the fire, and the two nuns, who were in the habit of spending their day in the church or at the presbytery. The cold, which grew more intense each day, almost froze the noses and ears of the pedestrians. Their feet began to pain them so that each step was a penance. And when they reached the open country, it looked so mournful and depressing in its limitless mantle of white that they all hastily retraced their steps, with bodies benumbed and hearts heavy. The 4 women walked in front, and the 3 men followed a little in their rear. L'Oiseau, who saw perfectly well how matters stood, asked suddenly if that trollop were going to keep them waiting much longer in this godforsaken spot. The Count, always courteous, replied that they could not exact so painful a sacrifice from any woman, and that the first move must come from herself. Monsieur Carlamadon remarked that if the French, as they talked of doing, made a counter-attack by way of Dieppe, their encounter with the enemy must inevitably take place at Totes. This reflection made the other 2 anxious. "Supposing we escape on foot," said L'Oiseau. The Count shrugged his shoulders. "How can you think of such a thing, in this snow? And with our wives? Besides, we should be pursued at once, overtaken in 10 minutes, and brought back as prisoners at the mercy of the soldiery." This was true enough. They were silent. The ladies talked of dress, but a certain constraint seemed to prevail among them. Suddenly, at the end of the street, the officer appeared. His tall, wasp-like, uniformed figure was outlined against the snow which bounded the horizon, and he walked, knees apart, with that motion peculiar to soldiers, who are always anxious not to soil their carefully polished boots. He bowed as he passed the ladies, then glanced scornfully at the men, who had sufficient dignity not to raise their hats, though L'Oiseau made a movement to do so. Boule de Suif flushed crimson to the ears, and the 3 married women felt unutterably humiliated at being met thus by the soldier in company with the girl whom he had treated with such scant ceremony. Then they began to talk about him, his figure, and his face. Madame Carlamadon, who had known many officers and judged them as a connoisseur, thought him not at all bad-looking. She even regretted that he was not a Frenchman, because in that case he would have made a very handsome hussar, with whom all the women would assuredly have fallen in love. When they were once more within doors, they did not know what to do with themselves. Sharp words even were exchanged apropos of the merest trifles. The silent dinner was quickly over, and each one went to bed early in the hope of sleeping, and thus killing time. They came down next morning with tired faces and irritable tempers. The women scarcely spoke to Boule de Suif. A church bell summoned the faithful to a baptism. Boule de Suif had a child being brought up by peasants at Yvetot. She did not see him once a year, and never thought of him, but the idea of the child who was about to be baptized induced a sudden wave of tenderness for her own, and she insisted on being present at the ceremony. As soon as she had gone out, the rest of the company looked at one another and then drew their chairs together, for they realized that they must decide on some course of action. L'Oiseau had an inspiration. He proposed that they should ask the officer to detain Boule de Suif only, and to let the rest depart on their way. Monsieur Follenvie was entrusted with this commission, but he returned to them almost immediately. The German, who knew human nature, had shown him the door. He intended to keep all the travelers until his condition had been complied with. Whereupon Madame L'Oiseau's vulgar temperament broke bounds, We're not going to die of old age here," she cried. "Since it's that vixen's trade to behave so with men, I don't see that she has any right to refuse one more than another. I may as well tell you she took any lovers she could get at Rouen, even coachmen. Yes, indeed, madam, the coachman at the prefecture. I know it for a fact, for he buys his wine of us. And now that it is a question of getting us out of a difficulty, she puts on virtuous airs, the drab. For my part, I think this officer has behaved very well. Why, there were 3 others of us, any one of whom he would undoubtedly have preferred. But no, he contents himself with the girl who is common property. He respects married women. Just think. He is master here." He had only to say, "I wish it," and he might have taken us by force, with the help of his soldiers. The 2 other women shuddered, the eyes of pretty Madame Carlomadon glistened, and she grew pale, as if the officer were indeed in the act of laying violent hands on her. The men, who had been discussing the subject among themselves, drew near. Loiseau, in a state of furious resentment, was for delivering up that miserable woman, bound hand and foot, into the enemy's power. But the Count, descended from 3 generations of ambassadors, and endowed, moreover, with the lineaments of a diplomat, was in favor of more tactful measures. "We must persuade her," he said. Then they laid their plans. The women drew together. They lowered their voices, and the discussion became general, each giving his or her opinion. But the conversation was not in the least coarse. The ladies, in particular, were adepts at delicate phrases and charming subtleties of expression to describe the most improper things. A stranger would have understood none of their allusions. So guarded was the language they employed. But, seeing that the thin veneer of modesty with which every woman of the world is furnished goes but a very little way below the surface, they began rather to enjoy this unedifying episode, and at bottom were hugely delighted, feeling themselves in their element, furthering the schemes of lawless love with the gusto of a gourmand cook who prepares supper for another. Their gaiety returned of itself. So amusing at last did the whole business seem to them. The Count uttered several rather risky witticisms, but so tactfully were they said that his audience could not help smiling. Loiseau in turn made some considerably broader jokes, but no one took offense, and the thought expressed with such brutal directness by his wife was uppermost in the minds of all. Since it's the girl's trade, why should she refuse this man more than another? Dainty Madame Carlomadon seemed to think even that in Boule de Suif's place she would be less inclined to refuse him than another. The blockade was as carefully arranged as if they were investing a fortress. Each agreed on the role which he or she was to play, the arguments to be used, the maneuvers to be executed. They decided on the plan of campaign, the stratagems they were to employ, and the surprise attacks which were to reduce this human citadel and force it to receive the enemy within its walls. But Cornudet remained apart from the rest, taking no share in the plot. So absorbed was the attention of all that Boule de Suif's entrance was almost unnoticed. But the Count whispered a gentle hush, which made the others look up. She was there. They suddenly stopped talking, and a vague embarrassment prevented them for a few moments from addressing her. But the Countess, more practiced than the others in the wiles of the drawing room, asked her, was the baptism interesting? The girl, still under the stress of emotion, told what she had seen and heard. Described the faces, the attitudes of those present, and even the appearance of the church. She concluded with the words, "It does one good to pray sometimes." Until lunchtime the ladies contented themselves with being pleasant to her, so as to increase her confidence and make her amenable to their advice. As soon as they took their seats at table the attack began. First they opened a vague conversation on the subject of self-sacrifice. Ancient examples were quoted. Judith and Holofernes, then, irrationally enough, Lucrece and Sextus, Cleopatra and the hostile generals whom she reduced to abject slavery by a surrender of her charms. Next was recounted an extraordinary story, born of the imagination of these ignorant millionaires, which told how the matrons of Rome seduced Hannibal, his lieutenants, and all his mercenaries at Capua. They held up to admiration all those women who from time to time have arrested the victorious progress of conquerors, made of their bodies a field of battle, a means of ruling, a weapon, who have vanquished by their heroic caresses hideous or detested beings, and sacrificed their chastity to vengeance and devotion. All was said with due restraint and regard for propriety. The effect heightened now and then by an outburst of forced enthusiasm calculated to excite emulation. A listener would have thought at last that the one role of woman on earth was a perpetual sacrifice of her person, a continual abandonment of herself to the caprices of a hostile soldiery. The two nuns seemed to hear nothing, and to be lost in thought. Boule de Suif also was silent. During the whole afternoon she was left to her reflections. But instead of calling her Madame as they had done hitherto, her companions addressed her simply as Mademoiselle. Without exactly knowing why, but as if desirous of making her descend a step in the esteem she had won, and forcing her to realize her degraded position. Just as soup was served, Monsieur Follenvie reappeared, repeating his phrase of the evening before. The Prussian officer sends to ask if Mademoiselle Elisabeth Rousset has changed her mind. Boule de Suif answered briefly, "No, monsieur." But at dinner the coalition weakened. Loiseau made 3 unfortunate remarks. Each was cudgeling his brains for further examples of self-sacrifice, and could find none when the Countess, possibly without ulterior motive, and moved simply by a vague desire to do homage to religion, began to question the elder of the 2 nuns on the most striking facts in the lives of the saints. Now, it fell out that many of these had committed acts which would be crimes in our eyes. But the Church readily pardons such deeds when they are accomplished for the glory of God or the good of mankind. This was a powerful argument, and the Countess made the most of it. Then, whether by reason of a tacit understanding, a thinly veiled act of complaisance such as those who wear the ecclesiastical habit excel in, or whether merely as the result of sheer stupidity, a stupidity admirably adapted to further their designs, the old nun rendered formidable aid to the conspirator. They had thought her timid, she proved herself bold, talkative, bigoted. She was not troubled by the ins and outs of casuistry. Her doctrines were as iron bars, her faith knew no doubt, her conscience no scruples. She looked on Abraham's sacrifice as natural enough. for she herself would not have hesitated to kill both father and mother if she had received a divine order to that effect, and nothing, in her opinion, could displease our Lord, provided the motive were praiseworthy. The Countess, putting to good use the consecrated authority of her unexpected ally, led her on to make a lengthy and edifying paraphrase of that axiom enunciated by a certain school of moralists: the end justifies the means. Then, sister, she asked, you think God accepts all methods, and pardons the act when the motive is pure? Undoubtedly, madam. An action reprehensible in itself often derives merit from the thought which inspires it. And in this wise they talked on, fathoming the wishes of God, predicting his judgments, describing him as interested in matters which assuredly concern him but little. All was said with the utmost care and discretion. But every word uttered by the holy woman in her nun's garb weakened the indignant resistance of the courtesan. Then the conversation drifted somewhat, and the nun began to talk of the convents of her order, of her superior, of herself, and of her fragile little neighbor, Sister Saint Nicephore. They had been sent for from Havre to nurse the hundreds of soldiers who were in hospitals, stricken with smallpox. She described these wretched invalids and their malady. And, while they themselves were detained on their way by the caprices of the Prussian officer, scores of Frenchmen might be dying, whom they would otherwise have saved. For the nursing of soldiers was the old nun's specialty. She had been in the Crimea, in Italy, in Austria. And as she told the story of her campaigns, she revealed herself as one of those holy sisters of the fife and drum who seem designed by nature to follow camps, to snatch the wounded from amid the strife of battle, and to quell with a word, more effectually than any general, the rough and insubordinate troopers, a masterful woman. Her seamed and pitted face itself an image of the devastations of war. No one spoke when she had finished for fear of spoiling the excellent effect of her words. As soon as the meal was over, the travelers retired to their rooms, whence they emerged the following day at a late hour of the morning. Luncheon passed off quietly. The seed sown the preceding evening was being given time to germinate and bring forth fruit. In the afternoon, the Countess proposed a walk. Then the Count, as had been arranged beforehand, took Boule de Suif's arm, and walked with her at some distance behind the rest. He began talking to her in that familiar, paternal, slightly contemptuous tone which men of his class adopt in speaking to women like her, calling her my dear child, and talking down to her from the height of his exalted social position and stainless reputation. He came straight to the point. So you prefer to leave us here, exposed like yourself to all the violence which would follow on a repulse of the Prussian troops, rather than consent to surrender yourself, as you have done so many times in your life? The girl did not reply. He tried kindness, argument, sentiment. He still bore himself as Count, even while adopting, when desirable, an attitude of gallantry, and making pretty, nay, even tender, speeches. He exalted the service she would render them, spoke of their gratitude, then, suddenly, using the familiar thou colon and you know, my dear. He could boast then of having made a conquest of a pretty girl such as he won't often find in his own country. Boule de Suif did not answer, and joined the rest of the party. As soon as they returned she went to her room, and was seen no more. The general anxiety was at its height. What would she do? If she still resisted, how awkward for them all. The dinner hour struck. They waited for her in vain. At last Monsieur Follenvie entered, announcing that Mademoiselle Rousset was not well, and that they might sit down to table. They all pricked up their ears. The Count drew near the innkeeper, and whispered, "Is it all right?" "Yes." Out of regard for propriety he said nothing to his companions, but merely nodded slightly toward them. A great sigh of relief went up from all breasts. Every face was lighted up with joy. "By Gad," shouted Loiseau, "I'll stand champagne all round if there's any to be found in this place." And great was Madame Loiseau's dismay when the proprietor came back with 4 bottles in his hands. They had all suddenly become talkative and merry. A lively joy filled all hearts. The Count seemed to perceive for the first time that Madame Laomedon was charming. The manufacturer paid compliments to the Countess. The conversation was animated, sprightly, witty, and, although many of the jokes were in the worst possible taste, all the company were amused by them, and none offended, indignation being dependent, like other emotions, on surroundings. And the mental atmosphere had gradually become filled with gross imaginings and unclean thoughts. At dessert even the women indulged in discreetly worded allusions. Their glances were full of meaning. They had drunk much. The Count, who even in his moments of relaxation preserved a dignified demeanor, hit on a much appreciated comparison of the condition of things with the termination of a winter spent in the icy solitude of the North Pole and the joy of shipwrecked mariners who at last perceive a southward track opening out before their eyes. Loiseau, fairly in his element, rose to his feet, holding aloft a glass of champagne. "I drink to our deliverance," he shouted. All stood up and greeted the toast with acclamation. Even the 2 good sisters yielded to the solicitations of the ladies, and consented to moisten their lips with the foaming wine, which they had never before tasted. They declared it was like effervescent lemonade, but with a pleasanter flavor. "It is a pity," said Loiseau, "that we have no piano. We might have had a quadrille." Cornudet had not spoken a word or made a movement. He seemed plunged in serious thought, and now and then tugged furiously at his great beard, as if trying to add still further to its length. At last, toward midnight, when they were about to separate, Loiseau, whose gait was far from steady, suddenly slapped him on the back, saying thickly, "You're not jolly tonight. Why are you so silent, old man?" Cornudet threw back his head, cast one swift and scornful glance over the assemblage, and answered, "I tell you all. You have done an infamous thing." He rose, reached the door, and repeating, "Infamous," disappeared. A chill fell on all. Loiseau himself looked foolish and disconcerted for a moment, but soon recovered his aplomb, and, writhing with laughter, exclaimed, "Really, you are all too green for anything." Pressed for an explanation, he related the mysteries of the corridor, whereat his listeners were hugely amused. The ladies could hardly contain their delight. The Count and Monsieur Laomedon laughed till they cried. They could scarcely believe their ears. "What? You are sure?" he wanted. "I tell you I saw it with my own eyes." "And she refused?" "Because the Prussian was in the next room." "Surely you are mistaken?" "I swear I'm telling you the truth." The Count was choking with laughter. The manufacturer held his sides. Wasso continued. So you may well imagine he doesn't think this evening's business at all amusing. And all three began to laugh again, choking, coughing, almost ill with merriment. Then they separated. But Madame Wasso, who was nothing if not spiteful, remarked to her husband as they were on the way to bed that stuck-up little minx of a Carlomadon had laughed on the wrong side of her mouth all the evening. You know, she said, when women run after uniforms, it's all the same to them whether the men who wear them are French or Prussian. It's perfectly sickening. The next morning the snow showed dazzling white tinder a clear winter sun. The coach, ready at last, waited before the door, while a flock of white pigeons, with pink eyes spotted in the centers with black, puffed out their white feathers and walked sedately between the legs of the 6 horses, picking at the steaming manure. The driver, wrapped in his sheepskin coat, was smoking a pipe on the box, and all the passengers, radiant with delight at their approaching departure, were putting up provisions for the remainder of the journey. They were waiting only for Boule de Suif. At last she appeared. She seemed rather shamefaced and embarrassed, and advanced with timid step toward her companions, who with one accord turned aside as if they had not seen her. The Count, with much dignity, took his wife by the arm, and removed her from the unclean contact. The girl stood still, stupefied with astonishment, then, plucking up courage, accosted the manufacturer's wife with a humble good morning. Madam, to which the other replied merely with a slight and insolent nod, accompanied by a look of outraged virtue. Every one suddenly appeared extremely busy, and kept as far from Boule de Suif as if her skirts had been infected with some deadly disease. Then they hurried to the coach, followed by the despised courtesan, who, arriving last of all, silently took the place she had occupied during the first part of the journey. The rest seemed neither to see nor to know her, all save Madame Wasso, who, glancing contemptuously in her direction, remarked, half aloud, to her husband, "What a mercy I am not sitting beside that creature." The lumbering vehicle started on its way, and the journey began afresh. At first no one spoke. Boule de Suif dared not even raise her eyes. She felt at once indignant with her neighbors, and humiliated at having yielded to the Prussian into whose arms they had so hypocritically cast her. But the Countess, turning toward Madame Carlomadon, soon broke the painful silence. "I think you know Madame d'Étrelles?" "Yes, she is a friend of mine. Such a charming woman. Delightful. Exceptionally talented, and an artist to the fingertips. She sings marvelously and draws to perfection." The manufacturer was chatting with the Count, and amid the clatter of the window panes a word of their conversation was now and then distinguishable: shares, maturity, premium, time limit. Wasso, who had abstracted from the inn the time-worn pack of cards, thick with the grease of 5 years' contact with half-wiped-off tables, started a game of bezique with his wife. The good sisters, taking up simultaneously the long rosaries hanging from their waists, made the sign of the cross, and began to mutter in unison interminable prayers, their lips moving ever more and more swiftly, as if they sought which should outdistance the other in the race of orisons. From time to time they kissed a medal, and crossed themselves anew, then resumed their rapid and unintelligible murmur. Cornudet sat still, lost in thought. At the end of 3 hours Loiseau gathered up the cards and remarked that he was hungry. His wife thereupon produced a parcel tied with string, from which she extracted a piece of cold veal. This she cut into neat, thin slices, and both began to eat. "We may as well do the same," said the Countess. The rest agreed, and she unpacked the provisions which had been prepared for herself, the Count, and the Care Lamadons. In one of those oval dishes, the lids of which are decorated with an earthenware hare, by way of showing that a game pie lies within, was a succulent delicacy consisting of the brown flesh of the game larded with streaks of bacon and flavored with other meats chopped fine. A solid wedge of Gruyere cheese, which had been wrapped in a newspaper, bore the imprint "Items of News" on its rich, oily surface. The two good sisters brought to light a hunk of sausage smelling strongly of garlic. And Cornudet, plunging both hands at once into the capacious pockets of his loose overcoat, produced from one 4 hard-boiled eggs and from the other a crust of bread. He removed the shells, threw them into the straw beneath his feet, and began to devour the eggs, letting morsels of the bright yellow yolk fall in his mighty beard, where they looked like stars. Boule de Suif, in the haste and confusion of her departure, had not thought of anything, and, stifling with rage, she watched all these people placidly eating. At first, ill-suppressed wrath shook her whole person, and she opened her lips to shriek the truth at them, to overwhelm them with a volley of insults, but she could not utter a word, so choked was she with indignation. No one looked at her, no one thought of her. She felt herself swallowed up in the scorn of these virtuous creatures, who had first sacrificed, then rejected her as a thing useless and unclean. Then she remembered her big basket full of the good things they had so greedily devoured, the 2 chickens coated in jelly, the pies, the pears, the 4 bottles of claret. And her fury broke forth like a cord that is overstrained, and she was on the verge of tears. She made terrible efforts at self-control, drew herself up, swallowed the sobs which choked her, but the tears rose nevertheless, shone at the brink of her eyelids, and soon 2 heavy drops coursed slowly down her cheeks. Others followed more quickly, like water filtering from a rock, and fell, one after another, on her rounded bosom. She sat upright, with a fixed expression, her face pale and rigid, hoping desperately that no one saw her give way. But the Countess noticed that she was weeping, and with a sign drew her husband's attention to the fact. He shrugged his shoulders, as if to say, "Well, what of it? It's not my fault." Madame Loiseau chuckled triumphantly, and murmured, "She's weeping for shame." The 2 nuns had betaken themselves once more to their prayers, first wrapping the remainder of their sausage in paper. Then Cornudet, who was digesting his eggs, stretched his long legs under the opposite seat, threw himself back, folded his arms, smiled like a man who had just thought of a good joke, and began to whistle the Marseillaise. The faces of his neighbors clouded. The popular air evidently did not find favor with them. They grew nervous and irritable, and seemed ready to howl as a dog does at the sound of a barrel organ. Cornudet saw the discomfort he was creating, and whistled the louder. Sometimes he even hummed the words, "Amour sacre de la patrie, conduis, citizens, nos bras vengeurs, liberté, liberté chérie, combats avec tes défenseurs." The coach progressed more swiftly, the snow being harder now, and all the way to Dieppe, during the long, dreary hours of the journey, first in the gathering dusk, then in the thick darkness, raising his voice above the rumbling of the vehicle, Cornudet continued with fierce obstinacy his vengeful and monotonous whistling, forcing his weary and exasperated hearers to follow the song from end to end, to recall every word of every line, as each was repeated over and over again with untiring persistency. And Boule de Suif still wept, and sometimes a sob she could not restrain was heard in the darkness between two verses of the song. Two friends besieged Paris was in the throes of famine. Even the sparrows on the roofs and the rats in the sewers were growing scarce. People were eating anything they could get. As Monsieur Maupassant, watchmaker by profession and idler for the nonce, was strolling along the boulevard one bright January morning, his hands in his trousers pockets and stomach empty, he suddenly came face to face with an acquaintance, Monsieur Sauvage, a fishing chum. Before the war broke out, Maupassant had been in the habit, every Sunday morning, of setting forth with a bamboo rod in his hand and a tin box on his back. He took the Argenteuil train, got out at Colombes, and walked thence to the Isle Morant. The moment he arrived at this place of his dreams he began fishing, and fished till nightfall. Every Sunday he met in this very spot Monsieur Sauvage, a stout, jolly, little man, a draper in the Rue Notre-Dame de Lorette, and also an ardent fisherman. They often spent half the day side by side, rod in hand and feet dangling over the water. And a warm friendship had sprung up between the two. Some days they did not speak, at other times they chatted, but they understood each other perfectly without the aid of words, having similar tastes and feelings. In the spring, about 10 o'clock in the morning, when the early sun caused a light mist to float on the water and gently warmed the backs of the two enthusiastic anglers, Maupassant would occasionally remark to his neighbor, "But it's pleasant here." To which the other would reply, "I can't imagine anything better." And these few words sufficed to make them understand and appreciate each other. In the autumn, toward the close of day, when the setting sun shed a blood-red glow over the western sky, and the reflection of the crimson clouds tinged the whole river with red, brought a glow to the faces of the two friends, and gilded the trees, whose leaves were already turning at the first chill touch of winter, Monsieur Sauvage would sometimes smile at Maupassant, and say, "What a glorious spectacle!" And Maupassant would answer, without taking his eyes from his float, "This is much better than the boulevard, isn't it?" As soon as they recognized each other, they shook hands cordially, affected at the thought of meeting under such changed circumstances. Monsieur Sauvage, with a sigh, murmured, "These are sad times." Maupassant shook his head mournfully, "And such weather! This is the first fine day of the year." The sky was, in fact, of a bright, cloudless blue. They walked along, side by side, reflective and sad. "And to think of the fishing," said Maupassant, "what good times we used to have." "When shall we be able to fish again?" asked Monsieur Sauvage. They entered a small café and took an absinthe together, then resumed their walk along the pavement. Maupassant stopped suddenly. "Shall we have another absinthe?" he said. "If you like," agreed Monsieur Sauvage. And they entered another wine shop. They were quite unsteady when they came out. owing to the effect of the alcohol on their empty stomachs. It was a fine, mild day, and a gentle breeze fanned their faces. The fresh air completed the effect of the alcohol on Monsieur Sauvage. He stopped suddenly, saying, "Suppose we go there?" "Where?" "Fishing." "But where?" "Why, to the old place. The French outposts are close to Colombes. I know Colonel Dumoulin, and we shall easily get leave to pass." Maupassant trembled with desire. "Very well. I agree." And they separated to fetch their rods and lines. An hour later they were walking side by side on the high road. Presently they reached the villa occupied by the colonel. He smiled at their request and granted it. They resumed their walk, furnished with a password. Soon they left the outposts behind them, made their way through deserted Colombes, and found themselves on the outskirts of the small vineyards which border the Seine. It was about 11 o'clock. Before them lay the village of Argenteuil, apparently lifeless. The heights of Orgement and Senoise dominated the landscape. The great plain, extending as far as Nanterre, was empty, quite empty, a waste of dun-colored soil and bare cherry trees. Monsieur Sauvage, pointing to the heights, murmured, "The Prussians are up yonder." And the sight of the deserted country filled the two friends with vague misgivings. The Prussians! They had never seen them as yet, but they had felt their presence in the neighborhood of Paris for months past, ruining France, pillaging, massacring, starving them. And a kind of superstitious terror mingled with the hatred they already felt toward this unknown, victorious nation. "Suppose we were to meet any of them," said Maupassant. "We'd offer them some fish," replied Monsieur Sauvage, with that Parisian light-heartedness which nothing can wholly quench. Still, they hesitated to show themselves in the open country, overawed by the utter silence which reigned around them. At last Monsieur Sauvage said boldly, "Come, we'll make a start. Only let us be careful." And they made their way through one of the vineyards, bent double, creeping along beneath the cover afforded by the vines, with eye and ear alert. A strip of bare ground remained to be crossed before they could gain the river bank. They ran across this, and, as soon as they were at the water's edge, concealed themselves among the dry reeds. Maupassant placed his ear to the ground, to ascertain, if possible, whether footsteps were coming their way. He heard nothing. They seemed to be utterly alone. Their confidence was restored, and they began to fish. Before them the deserted Ile Morant hid them from the farther shore. The little restaurant was closed, and looked as if it had been deserted for years. Monsieur Sauvage caught the first gudgeon, Monsieur Maupassant the second. And almost every moment one or other raised his line with a little, glittering, silvery fish wriggling at the end. They were having excellent sport. They slipped their catch gently into a close-meshed bag lying at their feet. They were filled with joy, the joy of once more indulging in a pastime of which they had long been deprived. The sun poured its rays on their backs. They no longer heard anything or thought of anything. They ignored the rest of the world. They were fishing. But suddenly a rumbling sound, which seemed to come from the bowels of the earth, shook the ground beneath them. The cannon were resuming their thunder. Maupassant turned his head and could see toward the left, beyond the banks of the river, the formidable outline of Mont Valérien, from whose summit arose a white puff of smoke. The next instant a second puff followed the first. And in a few moments a fresh detonation made the earth tremble. Others followed, and minute by minute the mountain gave forth its deadly breath and a white puff of smoke, which rose slowly into the peaceful heaven and floated above the summit of the cliff. Monsieur Sauvage shrugged his shoulders. "They are at it again," he said. Maupassant, who was anxiously watching his float bobbing up and down, was suddenly seized with the angry impatience of a peaceful man toward the madmen who were firing thus, and remarked indignantly, "What fools they are to kill one another like that." "They're worse than animals," replied Monsieur Sauvage. And Maupassant, who had just caught a bleak, declared, "And to think that it will be just the same so long as there are governments." "The Republic would not have declared war," interposed Monsieur Sauvage. Maupassant interrupted him. "Under a king we have foreign wars, under a republic we have civil war." And the two began placidly discussing political problems with the sound common sense of peaceful, matter-of-fact citizens, agreeing on one point, that they would never be free. And Mont Valérien thundered ceaselessly, demolishing the houses of the French with its cannonballs, grinding lives of men to powder, destroying many a dream, many a cherished hope, many a prospective happiness, ruthlessly causing endless woe and suffering in the hearts of wives, of daughters, of mothers, in other lands. "Such is life," declared Monsieur Sauvage. "Say, rather, such is death," replied Maupassant, laughing. But they suddenly trembled with alarm at the sound of footsteps behind them, and, turning round, they perceived close at hand 4 tall, bearded men, dressed after the manner of livery servants and wearing flat caps on their heads. They were covering the 2 anglers with their rifles. The rods slipped from their owner's grasp and floated away down the river. In the space of a few seconds they were seized, bound, thrown into a boat, and taken across to the Isle Morant. And behind the house they had thought deserted were about a score of German soldiers. A shaggy-looking giant, who was bestriding a chair and smoking a long clay pipe, addressed them in excellent French with the words, "Well, gentlemen, have you had good luck with your fishing?" Then a soldier deposited at the officer's feet the bag full of fish, which he had taken care to bring away. The Prussian smiled. "Not bad, I see. But we have something else to talk about. Listen to me, and don't be alarmed. You must know that, in my eyes, you are 2 spies sent to reconnoiter me and my movements. Naturally, I capture you and I shoot you. You pretended to be fishing, the better to disguise your real errand. You have fallen into my hands, and must take the consequences. Such is war. But as you came here through the outposts, you must have a password for your return. Tell me that password, and I will let you go." The 2 friends, pale as death, stood silently side by side, a slight fluttering of the hands alone betraying their emotion. "No one will ever know," continued the officer. "You will return peacefully to your homes, and the secret will disappear with you. If you refuse, it means death, instant death. Choose." They stood motionless, and did not open their lips. The Prussian, perfectly calm, went on, with hand outstretched toward the river. "Just think that in 5 minutes you will be at the bottom of that water. In 5 minutes. You have relations, I presume?" Mont Valérien still thundered. The 2 fishermen remained silent. The German turned and gave an order in his own language. Then he moved his chair a little way off, that he might not be so near the prisoners, and a dozen men stepped forward, rifle in hand, and took up a position 20 paces off. "I give you 1 minute," said the officer, not a second longer. Then he rose quickly, went over to the 2 Frenchmen, took Maupassant by the arm, led him a short distance off, and said in a low voice, "Quick! The password. Your friend will know nothing. I will pretend to relent." Maupassant answered not a word. Then the Prussian took Monsieur Sauvage aside in like manner, and made him the same proposal. Monsieur Sauvage made no reply. Again they stood side by side. The officer issued his orders. The soldiers raised their rifles. Then by chance Maupassant's eyes fell on the bag full of gudgeon lying in the grass a few feet from him. A ray of sunlight made the still quivering fish glisten like silver, and Maupassant's heart sank. Despite his efforts at self-control, his eyes filled with tears. "Goodbye, Monsieur Sauvage," he faltered. "Goodbye, Monsieur Maupassant," replied Sauvage. They shook hands, trembling from head to foot with a dread beyond their mastery. The officer cried, "Fire!" The 12 shots were as one. Monsieur Sauvage fell forward instantaneously. Maupassant, being the taller, swayed slightly and fell across his friend with face turned skyward and blood oozing from a rent in the breast of his coat. The German issued fresh orders. His men dispersed, and presently returned with ropes and large stones, which they attached to the feet of the 2 friends. Then they carried them to the river bank. Mont Valérien, its summit now enshrouded in smoke, still continued to thunder. 2 soldiers took Maupassant by the head and the feet. 2 others did the same with Sauvage. The bodies, swung lustily by strong hands, were cast to a distance, and, describing a curve, fell feet foremost into the stream. The water splashed high, foamed, eddied, then grew calm. Tiny waves lapped the shore. A few streaks of blood flecked the surface of the river. The officer, calm throughout, remarked, with grim humor, "It's the fish's turn now." Then he retraced his way to the house. Suddenly he caught sight of the net full of gudgeons, lying forgotten in the grass. He picked it up, examined it, smiled, and called, "Wilhelm." A white-aproned soldier responded to the summons, and the Prussian, tossing him the catch of the 2 murdered men, said, "Have these fish fried for me at once, while they are still alive. They'll make a tasty dish." Then he resumed his pipe. The Lancers' Wi-Fi. It was after Bourbaki's defeat in the east of France. The army, broken up, decimated, and worn out, had been obliged to retreat into Switzerland after that terrible campaign, and it was only its short duration that saved 150,000 men from certain death. Hunger, the terrible cold, forced marches in the snow without boots, over bad mountain roads, had caused us Franctireurs, especially, the greatest suffering, for we were without tents, and almost without food, always in the van when we were marching toward Belfort, and in the rear when returning by the Jura. Of our little band that had numbered 1,200 men on the 1st of January, there remained only 22 pale, thin, ragged wretches. When we at length succeeded in reaching Swiss territory, there we were safe, and could rest. Everybody knows what sympathy was shown to the unfortunate French army, and how well it was cared for. We all gained fresh life. And those who had been rich and happy before the war declared that they had never experienced a greater feeling of comfort than they did then. Just think. We actually had something to eat every day, and could sleep every night. Meanwhile, the war continued in the east of France, which had been excluded from the armistice. The Sansons still kept the enemy in check, and the latter had their revenge by ravaging Franche-Comté. Sometimes we heard that they had approached quite close to the frontier, and we saw Swiss troops, who were to form a line of observation between us and them, set out on their march. That pained us in the end, and, as we regained health and strength, the longing to fight took possession of us. It was disgraceful and irritating to know that within 2 or 3 leagues of us the Germans were victorious and insolent. To feel that we were protected by our captivity, and to feel that on that account we were powerless against them. One day our captain took 5 or 6 of us aside, and spoke to us about it, long and furiously. He was a fine fellow, that captain. He had been a sub-lieutenant in the Zouaves, was tall and thin and as hard as steel. And during the whole campaign he had cut out their work for the Germans. He fretted in inactivity, and could not accustom himself to the idea of being a prisoner and of doing nothing. "Confound it," he said to us, "does it not pain you to know that there is a number of Uhlans within 2 hours of us? Does it not almost drive you mad to know that those beggarly wretches are walking about as masters in our mountains, when 6 determined men might kill a whole spitful any day? I cannot endure it any longer, and I must go there." "But how can you manage it, Captain?" "How? It is not very difficult. Just as if we had not done a thing or two within the last 6 months, and got out of woods that were guarded by very different men from the Swiss. The day that you wish to cross over into France, I will undertake to get you there." "That may be. But what shall we do in France without any arms?" "Without arms? We will get them over yonder, by Jove." "You are forgetting the treaty," another soldier said. "We shall run the risk of doing the Swiss an injury, if Manchoufel learns that they have allowed prisoners to return to France." "Come," said the captain, "those are all bad reasons. I mean to go and kill some Prussians, that is all I care about. If you do not wish to do as I do, well and good, only say so at once. I can quite well go by myself, I do not require anybody's company." Naturally we all protested, and, as it was quite impossible to make the captain alter his mind, we felt obliged to promise to go with him. We liked him too much to leave him in the lurch, as he never failed us in any extremity, and so the expedition was decided on. Too, the captain had a plan of his own, that he had been cogitating over for some time. A man in that part of the country whom he knew was going to lend him a cart and 6 suits of peasants' clothes. We could hide under some straw at the bottom of the wagon, which would be loaded with Gruyere cheese, which he was supposed to be going to sell in France. The captain told the sentinels that he was taking 2 friends with him to protect his goods, in case anyone should try to rob him, which did not seem an extraordinary precaution. A Swiss officer seemed to look at the wagon in a knowing manner, but that was in order to impress his soldiers. In a word, neither officers nor men could make it out, get up," the captain said to the horses, as he cracked his whip, while our 3 men quietly smoked their pipes. I was half suffocated in my box, which only admitted the air through those holes in front, and at the same time I was nearly frozen, for it was terribly cold. "Get up," the captain said again. And the wagon loaded with Gruyere cheese entered France. The Prussian lines were very badly guarded, as the enemy trusted to the watchfulness of the Swiss. The sergeant spoke North German, while our captain spoke the bad German of the 4 cantons, and so they could not understand each other. The sergeant, however, pretended to be very intelligent, and, in order to make us believe that he understood us, they allowed us to continue our journey, and, after traveling for 7 hours, being continually stopped in the same manner, we arrived at a small village of the Jura in ruins, at nightfall. What were we going to do? Our only arms were the captain's whip, our uniforms our peasants' blouses, and our food the Gruyere cheese. Our sole wealth consisted in our ammunition, packages of cartridges which we had stowed away inside some of the large cheeses. We had about 1,000 of them, just 200 each, but we needed rifles, and they must be chassepôts. Luckily, however, the captain was a bold man of an inventive mind, and this was the plan that he hit upon, while 3 of us remained hidden in a cellar in the abandoned village. He continued his journey as far as Besançon with the empty wagon and 1 man. The town was invested, but one can always make one's way into a town among the hills by crossing the tableland till within about 10 miles of the walls, and then following paths and ravines on foot. They left their wagon at Aumans, among the Germans, and escaped out of it at night on foot, so as to gain the heights which border the river Doubs. The next day they entered Besançon, where there were plenty of chassepôts. There were nearly 40,000 of them left in the arsenal, and General Roland, a brave marine, laughed at the captain's daring project, but let him have 6 rifles and wished him good luck. There he had also found his wife, who had been through all the war with us before the campaign in the East, and who had been only prevented by illness from continuing with Bourbaki's army. She had recovered, however, in spite of the cold, which was growing more and more intense, and in spite of the numberless privations that awaited her, she persisted in accompanying her husband. He was obliged to give way to her, and they all 3, the captain, his wife, and our comrade, started on their expedition. Going was nothing in comparison to returning. They were obliged to travel by night, so as to avoid meeting anybody, as the possession of 6 rifles would have made them liable to suspicion. But, in spite of everything, a week after leaving us, the captain and his 2 men were back with us again. The campaign was about to begin. The first night of his arrival he began it himself, and, under pretext of examining the surrounding country, he went along the high road. I must tell you that the little village which served as our fortress was a small collection of poor, badly built houses, which had been deserted long before. It lay on a steep slope, which terminated in a wooded plain. The country people sell the wood, they send it down the slopes, which are called coulees, locally, and which lead down to the plain. And there they stack it into piles, which they sell thrice a year to the wood merchants. The spot where this market is held and indicated by 2 small houses by the side of the high road, which serve for public houses. The captain had gone down there by way of one of these coolies. He had been gone about half an hour, and we were on the lookout at the top of the ravine, when we heard a shot. The captain had ordered us not to stir, and only to come to him when we heard him blow his trumpet. It was made of a goat's horn, and could be heard a league off. But it gave no sound, and, in spite of our cruel anxiety, we were obliged to wait in silence, with our rifles by our side. It is nothing to go down these coulees. One just lets oneself slide down, but it is more difficult to get up again. One has to scramble up by catching hold of the hanging branches of the trees, and sometimes on all fours, by sheer strength. A whole mortal hour passed, and he did not come. Nothing moved in the brushwood. The captain's wife began to grow impatient. What could he be doing? Why did he not call us? Did the shot that we had heard proceed from an enemy, and had he killed or wounded our leader, her husband? They did not know what to think. But I myself fancied either that he was dead or that his enterprise was successful, and I was merely anxious and curious to know what he had done. Suddenly we heard the sound of his trumpet, and we were much surprised that instead of coming from below, as we had expected, it came from the village behind us. What did that mean? It was a mystery to us, but the same idea struck us all, that he had been killed, and that the Prussians were blowing the trumpet to draw us into an ambush. We therefore returned to the cottage, keeping a careful lookout with our fingers on the trigger, and hiding under the branches, but his wife, in spite of our entreaties, rushed on, leaping like a tigress. She thought that she had to avenge her husband, and had fixed the bayonet to her rifle, and we lost sight of her at the moment that we heard the trumpet again, and a few moments later, we heard her calling out to us, "Come on! Come on! He is alive! It is he!" We hastened on, and saw the captain smoking his pipe at the entrance of the village. But strangely enough, he was on horseback. "Ah," he said to us, "you see that there is something to be done here. Here I am on horseback already. I knocked over an Yulin yonder," and took his horse. I suppose they were guarding the wood, but it was by drinking and swilling in clover. One of them, the sentry at the door, had not time to see me before I gave him a sugar plum in his stomach, and then, before the others could come out, I jumped on the horse and was off like a shot. 8 or 10 of them followed me, I think, but I took the crossroads through the woods. I have got scratched and torn a bit, but here I am, and now, my good fellows, attention, and take care. Those brigands will not rest until they have caught us, and we must receive them with rifle bullets. Come along, let us take up our posts. We set out. One of us took up his position a good way from the village on the crossroads. I was posted at the entrance of the main street, where the road from the level country enters the village, while the 2 others, the captain and his wife, were in the middle of the village, near the church, whose tower served for an observatory and citadel. We had not been in our places long before we heard a shot, followed by another, and then 2, then 3. The first was evidently a chassepot. One recognized it by the sharp report, which sounds like the crack of a whip, while the other 3 came from the lancers' carbines. The captain was furious. He had given orders to the outpost to let the enemy pass and merely to follow them at a distance if they marched toward the village. and to join me when they had gone well between the houses. Then they were to appear suddenly, take the patrol between two fires, and not allow a single man to escape, for, posted as we were, the 6 of us could have hemmed in 10 Prussians, if needful. That confounded Piedlot has roused them, the captain said, and they will not venture to come on blindfolded any longer. And then I am quite sure that he has managed to get a shot into himself somewhere or other, for we hear nothing of him. It serves him right. Why did he not obey orders? And then, after a moment, he grumbled in his beard, "After all, I am sorry for the poor fellow. He is so brave, and shoots so well." The captain was right in his conjectures. We waited until evening. Without seeing the Uhlans, they had retreated after the first attack, but unfortunately we had not seen Piedlot either. Was he dead or a prisoner? When night came, the captain proposed that we should go out and look for him, and so the 3 of us started. At the crossroads we found a broken rifle and some blood, while the ground was trampled down. But we did not find either a wounded man or a dead body, although we searched every thicket, and at midnight we returned without having discovered anything of our unfortunate comrade. "It is very strange," the captain growled. "They must have killed him and thrown him into the bushes somewhere. They cannot possibly have taken him prisoner, as he would have called out for help. I cannot understand it at all." Just as he said that, bright flames shot up in the direction of the inn on the high road, which illuminated the sky. "Scoundrels! Cowards!" he shouted. "I will bet that they have set fire to the 2 houses on the marketplace, in order to have their revenge. And then they will scuttle off without saying a word. They will be satisfied with having killed a man and set fire to 2 houses. All right. It shall not pass over like that. We must go for them. They will not like to leave their illuminations in order to fight. It would be a great stroke of luck if we could set Piedlot free at the same time," someone said. The 5 of us set off, full of rage and hope. In 20 minutes we had got to the bottom of the coulee, and had not yet seen anyone when we were within 100 yards of the inn. The fire was behind the house, and all we saw of it was the reflection above the roof. However, we were walking rather slowly, as we were afraid of an ambush, when suddenly we heard Piedlot's well-known voice. It had a strange sound, however, for it was at the same time dull and vibrating, stifled and clear, as if he were calling out as loud as he could with a bit of rag stuffed into his mouth. He seemed to be hoarse and gasping, and the unlucky fellow kept exclaiming, "Help! Help!" We sent all thoughts of prudence to the devil, and in 2 bounds we were at the back of the inn, where a terrible sight met our eyes. For Piedlot was being burned alive. He was writhing in the midst of a heap of faggots, tied to a stake, and the flames were licking him with their burning tongues. When he saw us, his tongue seemed to stick in his throat. He drooped his head, and seemed as if he were going to die. It was only the affair of a moment to upset the burning pile, to scatter the embers, and to cut the ropes that fastened him. Poor fellow! In what a terrible state we found him! The evening before he had had his left arm broken, and it seemed as if he had been badly beaten since then, for his whole body was covered with wounds, bruises and blood. The flames had also begun their work on him, and he had 2 large burns, one on his loins and the other on his right thigh. and his beard and hair were scorched. Poor Pedlot! No one knows the terrible rage we felt at this sight. We would have rushed headlong at 100,000 Prussians. Our thirst for vengeance was intense. But the cowards had run away, leaving their crime behind them. Where could we find them now? Meanwhile, however, the captain's wife was looking after Pedlot and dressing his wounds as best she could, while the captain himself shook hands with him excitedly. And in a few minutes he came to himself. "Good morning, Captain. Good morning, all of you," he said. "Ah, the scoundrels, the wretches! Why, 20 of them came to surprise us." 20, do you say? Yes. There was a whole band of them, and that is why I disobeyed orders, Captain, and fired on them, for they would have killed you all, and I preferred to stop them. That frightened them, and they did not venture to go farther than the crossroads. They were such cowards. 4 of them shot at me at 20 yards, as if I had been a target. And then they slashed me with their swords. My arm was broken, so that I could only use my bayonet with one hand. But why did you not call for help? I took good care not to do that. For you would all have come, and you would neither have been able to defend me nor yourselves, being only 5 against 20. You know that we should not have allowed you to have been taken, poor old fellow. I preferred to die by myself, don't you see? I did not want to bring you here, for it would have been a mere ambush. Well, we will not talk about it any more. Do you feel rather easier? No, I am suffocating. I know that I cannot live much longer. The brutes! They tied me to a tree, and beat me till I was half dead, and then they shook my broken arm, but I did not make a sound. I would rather have bitten my tongue out than have called out before them. Now I can tell what I am suffering and shed tears. It does one good. Thank you, my kind friends. Poor Pedlot! But we will avenge you, you may be sure. Yes, yes, I want you to do that. There is, in particular, a woman among them who passes as the wife of the lancer whom the captain killed yesterday. She is dressed like a lancer, and she tortured me the most yesterday, and suggested burning me, and it was she who set fire to the wood. Oh, the wretch, the brute! Ah, how I am suffering! My loins, my arms, and he fell back gasping and exhausted, writhing in his terrible agony, while the captain's wife wiped the perspiration from his forehead, and we all shed tears of grief and rage, as if we had been children. I will not describe the end to you. He died half an hour later, previously telling us in what direction the enemy had gone. When he was dead, we gave ourselves time to bury him. And then we set out in pursuit of them. With our hearts full of fury and hatred, we will throw ourselves on the whole Prussian army, if it be necessary, the captain said. But we will avenge Pedlot. We must catch those scoundrels. Let us swear to die, rather than not to find them, and if I am killed first, these are my orders. All the prisoners that you take are to be shot immediately, and as for the lancer's wife, she is to be tortured before she is put to death. She must not be shot, because she is a woman. The captain's wife said, "If you survive, I am sure that you would not shoot a woman. Torturing her will be quite sufficient, But if you are killed in this pursuit, I want one thing. And that is to fight with her. I will kill her with my own hands, and the others can do what they like with her if she kills me. We will outrage her. We will burn her. We will tear her to pieces. Pedlot shall be avenged, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The next morning we unexpectedly fell on an outpost of Ulan 4 leagues away. Surprised by our sudden attack, they were not able to mount their horses, nor even to defend themselves, and in a few moments we had 5 prisoners, corresponding to our own number. The captain questioned them, and from their answers we felt certain that they were the same whom we had encountered the previous day. Then a very curious operation took place. One of us was told off to ascertain their sex, and nothing can describe our joy when we discovered what we were seeking among them, the female executioner who had tortured our friend. The 4 others were shot on the spot, with their backs to us and close to the muzzles of our rifles, and then we turned our attention to the woman. What were we going to do with her? I must acknowledge that we were all of us in favor of shooting her. Hatred and the wish to avenge Pedlot had extinguished all pity in us. And we had forgotten that we were going to shoot a woman, but a woman reminded us of it, the captain's wife. At her entreaties, therefore, we determined to keep her a prisoner. The captain's poor wife was to be severely punished for this act of clemency. The next day we heard that the armistice had been extended to the eastern part of France, and we had to put an end to our little campaign. 2 of us, who belonged to the neighborhood, returned home, so there were only 4 of us, all told, the captain, his wife, and 2 men. We belonged to Besançon, which was still being besieged in spite of the armistice. Let us stop here, said the captain. I cannot believe that the war is going to end like this. The devil take it. Surely there are men still left in France, and now is the time to prove what they are made of. The spring is coming on, and the armistice is only a trap laid for the Prussians. During the time that it lasts, a new army will be raised, and some fine morning we shall fall upon them again. We shall be ready. And we have a hostage, let us remain here. We fixed our quarters there. It was terribly cold, and we did not go out much, and somebody had always to keep the female prisoner in sight. She was sullen, and never said anything, or else spoke of her husband, whom the captain had killed. She looked at him continually with fierce eyes, and we felt that she was tortured by a wild longing for revenge. That seemed to us to be the most suitable punishment for the terrible torments that she had made Pedlot suffer. For impotent vengeance is such intense pain. Alas! We who knew how to avenge our comrade ought to have thought that this woman would know how to avenge her husband, and have been on our guard. It is true that one of us kept watch every night, and that at first we tied her by a long rope to the great oak bench that was fastened to the wall. But, by and by, as she had never tried to escape, in spite of her hatred for us, we relaxed our extreme prudence, and allowed her to sleep somewhere else except on the bench, and without being tied. What had we to fear? She was at the end of the room, a man was on guard at the door, and between her and the sentinel the captain's wife and 2 other men used to lie. She was alone and unarmed against 4, so there could be no danger. One night when we were asleep, and the captain was on guard, The lancer's wife was lying more quietly in her corner than usual, and she had even smiled for the first time since she had been our prisoner during the evening. Suddenly, however, in the middle of the night, we were all awakened by a terrible cry. We got up, groping about, and at once stumbled over a furious couple who were rolling about and fighting on the ground. It was the captain and the lancer's wife. We threw ourselves on them and separated them in a moment. She was shouting and laughing, and he seemed to have the death rattle. All this took place in the dark. Two of us held her, and when a light was struck, a terrible sight met our eyes. The captain was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, with an enormous gash in his throat, and his sword bayonet, that had been taken from his rifle, was sticking in the red, gaping wound. A few minutes afterward he died, without having been able to utter a word. His wife did not shed a tear. Her eyes were dry, her throat was contracted, and she looked at the lancer's wife steadfastly, and with a calm ferocity that inspired fear. "This woman belongs to me," she said to us suddenly. "You swore to me not a week ago to let me kill her as I chose, if she killed my husband. And you must keep your oath. You must fasten her securely to the fireplace, upright against the back of it, and then you can go where you like, but far from here. I will take my revenge on her myself. Leave the captain's body, and we three, he, she and I, will remain here." We obeyed, and went away. She promised to write to us to Geneva as we were returning thither. 2 days later I received the following letter, dated the day after we had left, that had been written at an inn on the high road. "My friend, I am writing to you, according to my promise. For the moment I am at the inn, where I have just handed my prisoner over to a Prussian officer. I must tell you, my friend, that this poor woman has left 2 children in Germany. She had followed her husband, whom she adored, as she did not wish him to be exposed to the risks of war by himself, and as her children were with their grandparents. I have learned all this since yesterday, and it has turned my ideas of vengeance into more humane feelings. At the very moment when I felt pleasure in insulting this woman, and in threatening her with the most fearful torments, in recalling Piedlot, who had been burned alive, and in threatening her with a similar death, she looked at me coldly, and said, "What have you got to reproach me with, Frenchwoman? You think that you will do right in avenging your husband's death, is not that so?" "Yes," I replied. "Very well, then, in killing him, I did what you are going to do in burning me. I avenged my husband, for your husband killed him." "Well," I replied, "as you approve of this vengeance, prepare to endure it. I do not fear it." And in fact she did not seem to have lost courage. Her face was calm, and she looked at me without trembling, while I brought wood and dried leaves together, and feverishly threw on to them the powder from some cartridges, which was to make her funeral pile the more cruel. I hesitated in my thoughts of persecution for a moment, but the captain was there, pale and covered with blood, and he seemed to be looking at me with his large, glassy eyes, and I applied myself to my work again after kissing his pale lips. Suddenly, however, on raising my head, I saw that she was crying, and I felt rather surprised. "So you are frightened?" I said to her. "No, but when I saw you kiss your husband, I thought of mine, of all whom I love." She continued to sob. But stopping suddenly, she said to me in broken words and in a low voice, "Have you any children?" A shiver ran over me, for I guessed that this poor woman had some. She asked me to look in a pocketbook which was in her bosom, and in it I saw 2 photographs of quite young children, a boy and a girl, with those kind, gentle, chubby faces that German children have. In it there were also 2 locks of light hair and a letter in a large, childish hand, and beginning with German words which meant, "My dear little mother." I could not restrain my tears, my dear friend, and so I untied her, and without venturing to look at the face of my poor dead husband, who was not to be avenged, I went with her as far as the inn. She is free, I have just left her, and she kissed me with tears. I am going upstairs to my husband. Come as soon as possible, my dear friend, to look for our 2 bodies. I set off with all speed, and when I arrived there was a Prussian patrol at the cottage, and when I asked what it all meant, I was told that there was a captain of Franksterers and his wife inside, both dead. I gave their names. They saw that I knew them, and I begged to be allowed to arrange their funeral. "Somebody has already undertaken it," was the reply. "Go in if you wish to, as you know them. You can settle about their funeral with their friend." I went in. The captain and his wife were lying side by side on a bed, and were covered by a sheet. I raised it, and saw that the woman had inflicted a similar wound in her throat to that from which her husband had died. At the side of the bed there sat, watching and weeping, the woman who had been mentioned to me as their best friend. It was the lancer's wife. The prisoners, there was not a sound in the forest save the indistinct, fluttering sound of the snow falling on the trees. It had been snowing since noon, a little fine snow that covered the branches as with frozen moss, and spread a silvery covering over the dead leaves in the ditches, and covered the roads with a white, yielding carpet, and made still more intense the boundless silence of this ocean of trees. Before the door of the forester's dwelling a young woman, her arms bare to the elbow, was chopping wood with a hatchet on a block of stone. She was tall, slender, strong, a true girl of the woods, daughter and wife of a forester. A voice called from within the house, "We are alone tonight, Bertheim, you must come in. It is getting dark, and there may be Prussians or wolves about." "I've just finished, mother," replied the young woman, splitting as she spoke an immense log of wood with strong, deft blows, which expanded her chest each time she raised her arms to strike. "Here I am, there's no need to be afraid. It's quite light still." Then she gathered up her sticks and logs, piled them in the chimney corner, went back to close the great oaken shutters, and finally came in, drawing behind her the heavy bolts of the door. Her mother, a wrinkled old woman whom age had rendered timid, was spinning by the fireside. "I am uneasy," she said, "when your father's not here. 2 women are not much good." "Oh," said the younger woman, "I'd cheerfully kill a wolf or a Prussian if it came to that." And she glanced at a heavy revolver hanging above the hearth. Her husband had been called upon to serve in the army at the beginning of the Prussian invasion, and the 2 women had remained alone with the old father, a keeper named Nicholas Pichon, sometimes called Longlegs, who refused obstinately to leave his home and take refuge in the town. This town was Rethel, an ancient stronghold built on a rock. Its inhabitants were patriotic, and had made up their minds to resist the invaders, to fortify their native place, and, if need be, to stand a siege as in the good old days. Twice already, under Henri IV and under Louis XIV, the people of Rethel had distinguished themselves by their heroic defense of their town. They would do as much now, by Gad, or else be slaughtered within their own walls. They had, therefore, bought cannon and rifles, organized a militia, and formed themselves into battalions and companies, and now spent their time drilling all day long in the square. All bakers, grocers, butchers, lawyers, carpenters, booksellers, chemists took their turn at military training at regular hours of the day, under the auspices of Monsieur Levine, a former non-commissioned officer in the dragoons, now a draper. Having married the daughter and inherited the business of Monsieur Revaudin, Sr., he had taken the rank of commanding officer in Rethel, and, seeing that all the young men had gone off to the war, he had enlisted all the others who were in favor of resisting an attack. Fat men now invariably walked the streets at a rapid pace, to reduce their weight and improve their breathing, and weak men carried weights to strengthen their muscles. And they awaited the Prussians. But the Prussians did not appear. They were not far off, however, for twice already their scouts had penetrated as far as the forest dwelling of Nicholas Pichon, called Longlegs, the old keeper, who could run like a fox, had come and warned the town. The guns had been got ready, but the enemy had not shown themselves. Longlegs' dwelling served as an outpost in the Avellini forest. Twice a week the old man went to the town for provisions and brought the citizens news of the outlying district. On this particular day he had gone to announce the fact that a small detachment of German infantry had halted at his house the day before, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and had left again almost immediately. The non-commissioned officer in charge spoke French. When the old man set out like this, he took with him his dogs, 2 powerful animals with the jaws of lions as a safeguard against the wolves, which were beginning to get fierce. And he left directions with the 2 women to barricade themselves securely within their dwelling as soon as night fell. The younger feared nothing, but her mother was always apprehensive, and repeated continually, "We'll come to grief one of these days. You see if we don't." This evening she was, if possible, more nervous than ever. "Do you know what time your father will be back?" she asked. "Oh, not before 11, for certain. When he dines with the commandant he's always late." And Bertheim was hanging her pot over the fire to warm the soup when she suddenly stood still, listening attentively to a sound that had reached her through the chimney. "There are people walking in the wood," she said, 7 or 8 men at least. The terrified old woman stopped her spinning wheel and gasped, "Oh, my God! And your father not here?" She had scarcely finished speaking when a succession of violent blows shook the door. As the woman made no reply, a loud, guttural voice shouted, "Open the door." After a brief silence the same voice repeated, "Open the door, or I'll break it down." Bertheim took the heavy revolver from its hook, slipped it into the pocket of her skirt, and, putting her ear to the door, asked, "Who are you?" demanded the young woman. "What do you want?" "The detachment that came here the other day," replied the voice. "My men and I have lost our way in the forest since morning. Open the door, or I'll break it down." The forester's daughter had no choice. She shot back the heavy bolts, threw open the ponderous shutter, and perceived in the wan light of the snow 6 men, 6 Prussian soldiers, the same who had visited the house the day before. "What are you doing here at this time of night?" she asked dauntlessly. "I lost my bearings," replied the officer, "lost them completely. Then I recognized this house. I've eaten nothing since morning, nor my men either. But I'm quite alone with my mother this evening," said Bertheim. "Never mind," replied the soldier, who seemed a decent sort of fellow. "We won't do you any harm, but you must give us something to eat. We are nearly dead with hunger and fatigue." Then the girl moved aside. "Come in," she said. Then entered, covered with snow, their helmets sprinkled with a creamy-looking froth, which gave them the appearance of meringues. They seemed utterly worn out. The young woman pointed to the wooden benches on either side of the large table. "Sit down," she said, "and I'll make you some soup. You certainly look tired out, and no mistake." Then she bolted the door afresh. She put more water in the pot, added butter and potatoes, then, taking down a piece of bacon from a hook in the chimney earner, cut it in 2 and slipped half of it into the pot. The 6 men watched her movements with hungry eyes. They had placed their rifles and helmets in a corner and waited for supper, as well behaved as children on a school bench. The old mother had resumed her spinning, casting from time to time a furtive and uneasy glance at the soldiers. Nothing was to be heard save the humming of the wheel, the crackling of the fire, and the singing of the water in the pot. But suddenly a strange noise, a sound like the harsh breathing of some wild animal sniffing under the door, startled the occupants of the room. The German officer sprang toward the rifles. Bertheim stopped him with a gesture, and said, smilingly, "It's only the wolves. They are like you, prowling hungry through the forest." The incredulous man wanted to see with his own eyes, and as soon as the door was opened he perceived 2 large grayish animals disappearing with long, swinging trot into the darkness. He returned to his seat, muttering, "I wouldn't have believed it." And he waited quietly till supper was ready. The men devoured their meal voraciously, with mouths stretched to their ears that they might swallow the more. Their round eyes opened at the same time as their jaws, and as the soup coursed down their throats it made a noise like the gurgling of water in a rainpipe. The 2 women watched in silence the movements of the big red beards. The potatoes seemed to be engulfed in these moving fleeces. But, as they were thirsty, the forester's daughter went down to the cellar to draw them some cider. She was gone some time. The cellar was small, with an arched ceiling, and had served, so people said, both as prison and as hiding place during the Revolution. It was approached by means of a narrow, winding staircase, closed by a trapdoor at the farther end of the kitchen. When Bertheim returned she was smiling mysteriously to herself. She gave the Germans her jug of cider. Then she and her mother supped apart, at the other end of the kitchen. The soldiers had finished eating, and were all 6 falling asleep as they sat round the table. Every now and then a forehead fell with a thud on the board, and the man, awakened suddenly, sat upright again. Bertheim said to the officer, "Go and lie down, all of you, round the fire. There's lots of room for 6. I'm going up to my room with my mother." and the two women went upstairs. They could be heard locking the door and walking about overhead for a time, then they were silent. The Prussians lay down on the floor, with their feet to the fire and their heads resting on their rolled-up cloaks. Soon all six snored loudly and uninterruptedly in 6 different keys. They had been sleeping for some time when a shot rang out so loudly that it seemed directed against the very walls of the house. The soldiers rose hastily. 2, then 3 more shots were fired. The door opened hastily, and Bertheim appeared, barefooted and only half-dressed, with her candle in her hand and a scared look on her face. "There are the French," she stammered, "at least 200 of them. If they find you here, they'll burn the house down. For God's sake, hurry down into the cellar, and don't make a sound. Whatever you do, if you make any noise, we are lost." We'll go, replied the terrified officer. "Which is the way?" The young woman hurriedly raised the small, square trapdoor, and the 6 men disappeared one after another down the narrow, winding staircase, feeling their way as they went. But as soon as the spike of the last helmet was out of sight, Bertheim lowered the heavy oaken lid, thick as a wall, hard as steel, furnished with the hinges and bolts of a prison cell, shot the 2 heavy bolts, and began to laugh long and silently, possessed with a mad longing to dance above the heads of her prisoners. They made no sound. Enclosed in the cellar as in a strong box, obtaining air only from a small, iron-barred vent-hole, Bertheim lighted her fire again, hung the pot over it, and prepared more soup, saying to herself, "Father will be tired tonight." Then she sat and waited. The heavy pendulum of the clock swung to and fro with a monotonous tick. Every now and then the young woman cast an impatient glance at the dial, a glance which seemed to say, "I wish he'd be quick." But soon there was a sound of voices beneath her feet. Low, confused words reached her through the masonry which roofed the cellar. The Prussians were beginning to suspect the trick she had played them. And presently the officer came up the narrow staircase, and knocked at the trapdoor. "Open the door," he cried. "What do you want?" she said, rising from her seat and approaching the cellarway. "Open the door." "I won't do any such thing." "Open it, or I'll break it down," shouted the man angrily. She laughed. "Hammer away, my good man. Hammer away." He struck with the butt end of his gun at the closed oaken door, but it would have resisted a battering ram. The forester's daughter heard him go down the stairs again. Then the soldiers came one after another and tried their strength against the trapdoor. But, finding their efforts useless, they all returned to the cellar and began to talk among themselves. The young woman heard them for a short time, then she rose, opened the door of the house, looked out into the night, and listened. A sound of distant barking reached her ear. She whistled just as a huntsman would, and almost immediately 2 great dogs emerged from the darkness and bounded to her side. She held them tight and shouted at the top of her voice, "Hello, Father." A far-off voice replied, "Hello, Bertheim." She waited a few seconds, then repeated, "Hello, Father." The voice, nearer now, replied, "Hello, Bertheim." "Don't go in front of the vent-hole," shouted his daughter. "There are Prussians in the cellar." Suddenly the man's tall figure could be seen to the left, standing between 2 tree trunks, Prussians in the cellar, he asked anxiously. What are they doing? The young woman laughed. They are the same as were here yesterday. They lost their way. And I've given them free lodgings in the cellar. She told the story of how she had alarmed them by firing the revolver, and had shut them up in the cellar. The man, still serious, asked, "But what am I to do with them at this time of night?" "Go and fetch Monsieur Levine with his men," she replied. "He'll take them prisoners. He'll be delighted." Her father smiled. "So he will delighted." "Here's some soup for you," said his daughter. "Eat it quick, and then be off." The old keeper sat down at the table and began to eat his soup, having first filled 2 plates and put them on the floor for the dogs. The Prussians, hearing voices, were silent. Longlegs set off a quarter of an hour later, and Bertheim, with her head between her hands, waited. The prisoners began to make themselves heard again. They shouted, called, and beat furiously with the butts of their muskets against the rigid trapdoor of the cellar. Then they fired shots through the vent-hole, hoping, no doubt, to be heard by any German detachment which chanced to be passing that way. The forester's daughter did not stir, but the noise irritated and unnerved her. Blind anger rose in her heart against the prisoners. She would have been only too glad to kill them all, and so silence them. Then, as her impatience grew, she watched the clock, counting the minutes as they passed. Her father had been gone an hour and a half. He must have reached the town by now. She conjured up a vision of him telling the story to Monsieur Levine, who grew pale with emotion, and rang for his servant to bring him his arms and uniform. She fancied she could bear the drum as it sounded the call to arms. Frightened faces appeared at the windows. The citizen soldiers emerged from their houses half-dressed, out of breath, buckling on their belts, and hurrying to the commandant's house. Then the troop of soldiers, with Longlegs at its head, set forth through the night and the snow toward the forest. She looked at the clock. They may be here in an hour. A nervous impatience possessed her. The minutes seemed interminable. Would the time never come? At last the clock marked the moment she had fixed on for their arrival, and she opened the door to listen for their approach. She perceived a shadowy form creeping toward the house. She was afraid and cried out. But it was her father. "They have sent me," he said, "to see if there is any change in the state of affairs." "No, none." Then he gave a shrill whistle. Soon a dark mass loomed up under the trees, the advance guard, composed of 10 men. "Don't go in front of the vent-hole," repeated Longlegs at intervals. And the first arrivals pointed out the much-dreaded vent-hole to those who came after. At last the main body of the troop arrived, in all 200 men, each carrying 200 cartridges. Monsieur Levine, in a state of intense excitement, posted them in such a fashion as to surround the whole house, save for a large space left vacant in front of the little hole on a level with the ground, through which the cellar derived its supply of air. Monsieur Levine struck the trapdoor a blow with his foot, and called, "I wish to speak to the Prussian officer." The German did not reply. The Prussian officer again shouted the commandant. Still no response. For the space of 20 minutes Monsieur Levine called on this silent officer to surrender with bag and baggage, promising him that all lives should be spared, and that he and his men should be accorded military honors. But he could extort no sign, either of consent or of defiance. The situation became a puzzling one. The citizen soldiers kicked their heels in the snow, slapping their arms across their chest, as cab drivers do, to warm themselves, and gazing at the vent hole with a growing and childish desire to pass in front of it. At last one of them took the risk, a man named Pot Devon, who was fleet of limb. He ran like a deer across the zone of danger. The experiment succeeded. The prisoners gave no sign of life. A voice cried, "There's no one there." And another soldier crossed the open space before the dangerous vent hole. Then this hazardous sport developed into a game. Every minute a man ran swiftly from one side to the other, like a boy playing baseball, kicking up the snow behind him as he ran. They had lighted big fires of dead wood at which to warm themselves, and the figures of the runners were illumined by the flames as they passed rapidly from the camp on the right to that on the left. Someone shouted, "It's your turn now, Maupassant." Maupassant was a fat baker, whose corpulent person served to point many a joke among his comrades. He hesitated. They chaffed him. Then, nerving himself to the effort, he set off at a little waddling gait, which shook his fat paunch and made the whole detachment laugh till they cried, "Bravo, bravo, Maupassant!" They shouted for his encouragement. He had accomplished about 2/3 of his journey when a long, crimson flame shot forth from the vent hole. A loud report followed, and the fat baker fell face forward to the ground, uttering a frightful scream. No one went to his assistance. Then he was seen to drag himself, groaning, on all fours through the snow until he was beyond danger, when he fainted. He was shot in the upper part of the thigh. After the first surprise and fright were over, they laughed at him again. But Monsieur Levin appeared on the threshold of the forester's dwelling. He had formed his plan of attack. He called in a loud voice, "I want Planchette, the plumber, and his workmen." 3 men approached. "Take the eavesdrops from the roof." In a quarter of an hour they brought the commandant 30 yards of pipes. Next, with infinite precaution, he had a small round hole drilled in the trapdoor. Then, making a conduit with the troughs from the pump to this opening, he said, with an air of extreme satisfaction, "Now we'll give these German gentlemen something to drink." A shout of frenzied admiration, mingled with uproarious laughter, burst from his followers, and the commandant organized relays of men, who were to relieve one another every 5 minutes. Then he commanded, "Pump," and, the pump handle having been set in motion, a stream of water trickled throughout the length of the piping, and flowed from step to step down the cellar stairs with a gentle, gurgling sound. They waited. An hour passed, then 2, then 3. The commandant, in a state of feverish agitation, walked up and down the kitchen, putting his ear to the ground every now and then to discover, if possible, what the enemy were doing and whether they would soon capitulate. The enemy was astir now. They could be heard moving the casks about, talking, splashing through the water. Then, about 8 o'clock in the morning, a voice came from the vent hole, "I want to speak to the French officer." Levin replied from the window, taking care not to put his head out too far. Do you surrender? I surrender. Then put your rifles outside. A rifle immediately protruded from the hole and fell into the snow, then another and another, until all were disposed of. And the voice which had spoken before said, I have no more. Be quick. I am drowned. Stop pumping, ordered the commandant. And the pump handle hung motionless. Then, having filled the kitchen with armed and waiting soldiers, he slowly raised the oaken trapdoor. For heads appeared, soaking wet, for fair heads with long, sandy hair. And one after another the 6 Germans emerged, scared, shivering, and dripping from head to foot. They were seized and bound. Then, as the French feared a surprise, they set off at once in 2 convoys, one in charge of the prisoners, and the other conducting Maupassant on a mattress borne on poles. They made a triumphal entry into Red Hell. Monsieur Levine was decorated as a reward for having captured a Prussian advance guard, and the fat baker received the military medal for wounds received at the hands of the enemy. 2 little soldiers every Sunday, as soon as they were free, the little soldiers would go for a walk. They turned to the right on leaving the barracks, crossed Courbevoie with rapid strides, as though on a forced march. Then, as the houses grew scarcer, they slowed down and followed the dusty road which leads to Bezins. They were small and thin, lost in their ill-fitting capes, too large and too long, whose sleeves covered their hands. Their ample red trousers fell in folds around their ankles. Under the high, stiff shako one could just barely perceive 2 thin, hollow-cheeked Breton faces, with their calm, naive blue eyes. They never spoke during their journey. Going straight before them, the same idea in each one's mind taking the place of conversation. For at the entrance of the little forest of Champioux they had found a spot which reminded them of home, and they did not feel happy anywhere else. At the crossing of the Colombe and Chatou roads, when they arrived under the trees, they would take off their heavy, oppressive headgear and wipe their foreheads. They always stopped for a while on the bridge at Bezins and looked at the Seine. They stood there several minutes, bending over the railing, watching the white sails, which perhaps reminded them of their home, and of the fishing smacks leaving for the open. As soon as they had crossed the Seine, they would purchase provisions at the delicatessen, the bakers, and the wine merchants. A piece of bologna, 4 cents worth of bread, and a quart of wine made up the luncheon which they carried away, wrapped up in their handkerchiefs. But as soon as they were out of the village their gait would slacken and they would begin to talk. Before them was a plain with a few clumps of trees, which led to the woods. A little forest which seemed to remind them of that other forest at Kermeriven. The wheat and oat fields bordered on the narrow path, and Jean Curterin said each time to Luc Lugonidek, "It's just like home, just like Plounavin. Yes, it's just like home." And they went on, side by side, their minds full of dim memories of home. They saw the fields, the hedges, the forests, and beaches. Each time they stopped near a large stone on the edge of the private estate, because it reminded them of the dolmen of Lochnuven. As soon as they reached the first clump of trees, Luc Lugonidek would cut off a small stick, and, whittling it slowly, would walk on, thinking of the folks at home. Jean Curterin carried the provisions. From time to time Luc would mention a name, or allude to some boyish prank which would give them food for plenty of thought. And the home country, so dear and so distant, would little by little gain possession of their minds, sending them back through space, to the well-known forms and noises, to the familiar scenery, with the fragrance of its green fields and sea air. They no longer noticed the smells of the city. And in their dreams they saw their friends leaving, perhaps forever, for the dangerous fishing grounds. They were walking slowly, Luc Lugonidek and Jean Curterin, contented and sad, haunted by a sweet sorrow. The slow and penetrating sorrow of a captive animal which remembers the days of its freedom. And when Luc had finished whittling his stick, they came to a little nook, where every Sunday they took their meal. They found the 2 bricks, which they had hidden in a hedge, and they made a little fire of dry branches and roasted their sausages on the ends of their knives. When their last crumb of bread had been eaten and the last drop of wine had been drunk, they stretched themselves out on the grass side by side, without speaking, their half-closed eyes looking away in the distance, their hands clasped as in prayer, their red-trousered legs mingling with the bright colors of the wildflowers. Towards noon they glanced, from time to time, towards the village of Bezins, for the dairy maid would soon be coming. Every Sunday she would pass in front of them on the way to milk her cow, the only cow in the neighborhood which was sent out to pasture. Soon they would see the girl, coming through the fields, and it pleased them to watch the sparkling sunbeams reflected from her shining pail. They never spoke of her. They were just glad to see her, without understanding why. She was a tall, strapping girl, freckled and tanned by the open air, a girl typical of the Parisian suburbs. Once, on noticing that they were always sitting in the same place, she said to them, "Do you always come here?" Luc Lugonidek, more daring than his friend, stammered, "Yes, we come here for our rest." That was all. But the following Sunday, on seeing them, she smiled with the kindly smile of a woman who understood their shyness, and she asked, "What are you doing here? Are you watching the grass grow?" Luc cheered up, smiled perhaps. She continued, "It's not growing fast, is it?" He answered, still laughing, "Not exactly." She went on. But when she came back with her pail full of milk, she stopped before them and said, "Want some? It will remind you of home." She had, perhaps instinctively, guessed and touched the right spot. Both were moved. Then, not without difficulty, she poured some milk into the bottle in which they had brought their wine. Luc started to drink, carefully watching lest he should take more than his share. Then he passed the bottle to Jean. She stood before them, her hands on her hips, her pail at her feet, enjoying the pleasure that she was giving them. Then she went on, saying, "Well, bye-bye until next Sunday." For a long time they watched her tall form as it receded in the distance, blending with the background, and finally disappeared. The following week, as they left the barracks, Jean said to Luc, "Don't you think we ought to buy her something good?" They were sorely perplexed by the problem of choosing something to bring to the dairy maid. Luc was in favor of bringing her some chitlins, but Jean, who had a sweet tooth, thought that candy would be the best thing. He won, and so they went to a grocery to buy 2 sous worth of red and white candies. This time they ate more quickly than usual. excited by anticipation. Jean was the first one to notice her. "There she is," he said, and Luke answered, "Yes, there she is." She smiled when she saw them, and cried, "Well, how are you today?" They both answered together, "All right." "How's everything with you?" Then she started to talk of simple things which might interest them, of the weather, of the crops, of her masters. They didn't dare to offer their candies, which were slowly melting in Jean's pocket. Finally Luke, growing bolder, murmured, "We have brought you something." She asked, "Let's see it." Then Jean, blushing to the tips of his ears, reached in his pocket, and drawing out the little paper bag, handed it to her. She began to eat the little sweet dainties. The two soldiers sat in front of her, moved and delighted. At last she went to do her milking, and when she came back she again gave them some milk. They thought of her all through the week and often spoke of her. The following Sunday she sat beside them for a longer time. The three of them sat there, side by side, their eyes looking far away in the distance, their hands clasped over their knees, and they told each other little incidents and little details of the villages where they were born. While the cow, waiting to be milked, stretched her heavy head toward the girl and mooed. Soon the girl consented to eat with them and to take a sip of wine. Often she brought them plums pocket, for plums were now ripe. Her presence enlivened the little Breton soldiers, who chattered away like two birds. One Tuesday something unusual happened to Luc Lugon-Iduc. He asked for leave and did not return until 10 o'clock at night. Jean, worried and racked his brain to account for his friends having obtained leave. The following Friday, Luc borrowed 10 sons from one of his friends, and once more asked and obtained leave for several hours. When he started out with Jean on Sunday he seemed queer, disturbed, changed. Curterin did not understand. He vaguely suspected something, but he could not guess what it might be. They went straight to the usual place, and lunched slowly. Neither was hungry. Soon the girl appeared. They watched her approach as they always did. When she was near, Luc arose and went towards her. She placed her pail on the ground and kissed him. She kissed him passionately, throwing her arms around his neck, without paying attention to Jean, without even noticing that he was there. Poor Jean was dazed, so dazed that he could not understand. His mind was upset and his heart broken, without his even realizing why. Then the girl sat down beside Luc, and they started to chat. Jean was not looking at them. He understood now why his friend had gone out twice during the week. He felt the pain and the sting which treachery and deceit leave in their wake. Luc and the girl went together to attend to the cow. Jean followed them with his eyes. He saw them disappear side by side, the red trousers of his friend making a scarlet spot against the white road. It was Luc who sank the stake to which the cow was tethered. The girl stooped down to milk the cow, while he absent-mindedly stroked the animal's glossy neck. Then they left the pail in the grass and disappeared in the woods. Jean could no longer see anything but the wall of leaves through which they had passed. He was unmanned so that he did not have strength to stand. He stayed there, motionless, bewildered and grieving simple, passionate grief. He wanted to weep, to run away, to hide somewhere, never to see anyone again. Then he saw them coming back again. They were walking slowly, hand in hand, as village lovers do. Luke was carrying the pail. After kissing him again, the girl went on, nodding carelessly to Jean. She did not offer him any milk that day. The two little soldiers sat side by side, motionless as always, silent and quiet, their calm faces in no way betraying the trouble in their hearts. The sun shone down on them. From time to time they could hear the plaintive lowing of the cow. At the usual time they arose to return. Luke was whittling a stick. Jean carried the empty bottle. He left it at the wine merchant's in Bezins. Then they stopped on the bridge, as they did every Sunday, and watched the water flowing by. Jean leaned over the railing, farther and farther.